You settle into the quiet, and I'll take it from here. Tonight, we'll drift back through time together, into a story you probably heard since childhood, though perhaps never quite like this. A story of a man who set out to cross the unknown seas. Though if you listen closely, you'll notice something that's often left out. The name, Christopher Columbus, stirs images of ships and flags, of new worlds and distant shores. Yet, before we arrive at any of that, let's pause on something simpler, softer. He began not with sails unfurled, but with a boyhood dream, whispered into the rhythm of the Mediterranean tides. Here's the twist, and you may not have expected it. Columbus, so often pictured as fearless, was for much of his early life a listener, an observer, a boy tracing maps by candlelight when others slept. Not the bold conqueror yet, but quiet learner, leaning over parchment in the hush of night. That is where the story truly begins. And knowing this, suddenly the vast ocean feels less like a battlefield, more like a lullaby carrying a child's secret wish toward tomorrow. Stay with me. Over the chapters to come, we'll follow his life not in rushing lines of conquest, but in soft candlelit steps, one room, one whisper, one meal at a time. In a moment, you'll see why this hidden detail, the boy bent over maps, is the key to everything. So let's turn down the lamp together and wander into Chapter 1. He was born in Genoa, a city of salt air and restless trade winds, around the year 1451. You can picture the stone streets sloping down toward the water, the scent of fish and tar, the murmur of sailors at every corner. Columbus, whose given name was Cristoforo Colombo, would have known the rhythm of seagulls before he knew the shape of the wider world. Imagine him as a boy walking barefoot across uneven stones, hearing voices in many tongues, Greek, Arabic, Italian, Catalan. Because Genoa was a crossroads, a city where everyone seemed to be arriving from somewhere else. It's soothing, isn't it, to imagine that before he touched the far edges of the Atlantic, his world was just this. Markets where olives shone black as polished glass, bakers sliding bread into brick ovens, scraps of songs drifting from open windows. He absorbed it all, quietly. His father, Domenico, worked as a wool weaver, and though he hoped his son might follow the trade, Columbus seemed drawn more often to the sea. At night, while the house settled into silence, he'd linger near the small lamp, sketching coastlines on scraps of parchment, his ears tuned to the wind outside. Stay with me here, because if you lean in, you'll sense the gentle contradiction. Columbus, remembered for his boldness, spent so much of his youth in patient stillness. He didn't rush. He listened. He watched older sailors return, their faces weathered, their stories of storms told in murmurs by the fire. He gathered those fragments the way you might gather seashells, each one a clue, each one a promise of places he'd never seen. Let's pause and breathe slowly with him on those nights. The lamp flickers. His mother hums in another room. The rain slips along the roof tiles. He does not yet know the oceans he will cross, but he knows the yearning, that low tide pulling inside his chest. You might recognize that feeling too, that quiet pull towards something not yet clear, a horizon you can't quite name. As he grew older, he apprenticed with traders, learning not only the handling of goods, but also the maps that charted their routes. Genoa's merchants dealt with spices, silks, and stories, and young Columbus learned to value each. There's something calming in thinking about the parchment maps he saw. Faded lines, guesses more than certainties, oceans drawn larger than land, the edges decorated with imagined creatures. To Columbus, these weren't fears. They were invitations. In a moment you'll see why this matters. But let's linger in the scene. Picture a boy in a wool tunic, the coarse fibers scratching lightly at his skin. He runs his fingers over the raised surface of ink, whispering the names of ports aloud like a chant. Lisbon, Cadiz, Tunis, Bruges. The names soothe him as lullabies soothe children, their syllables carrying far-off promise. And yet his life was not easy. The family struggled with debts, and Columbus had to balance his longing with practical needs. He worked in shops, learned arithmetic, and understood early that voyages cost more than dreams. This is another part of him people forget. He wasn't only a dreamer. He was also a planner, calculating and steady, patient enough to wait for the moment when sea and circumstance aligned. Let's lean the lamp lower and turn the page. Columbus eventually sailed as a teenager on trading voyages in the Mediterranean. Imagine the small ship creaking as it pushed away from Genoa's harbor, the stars overhead bright and indifferent. He learned to knot ropes, to read winds, to watch waves for signs of change. He was seasick sometimes, but he didn't let that discourage him. Even seasickness became part of the rhythm. The body's reminder that the sea takes getting used to, that every crossing is both discomfort and discovery. Breathe slowly, and imagine him on deck one midnight. The world so quiet, he could hear only the slap of water against wood. A lantern swings lightly. A sailor hums a tune. Columbus tilts his head back, staring into stars that seem infinite. And maybe in that moment, he wonders not only what lands lie ahead, but also whether anyone before him has ever gazed with exactly this mix of hope and unease. Stay with me, because in a moment, the boy will grow into the man, and the man into the voyager. But for now, let's allow him to be young still, leaning over the ship's edge, learning the sea as one learns a lullaby, by repetition, by listening, by trusting that each verse carries you farther. And when he returned to Genoa, stepping again onto stone streets, he carried with him more than cargo. He carried a memory of salt spray, the whisper of sails, the sight of coast vanishing behind him. And that memory, dear listener, never left him. It waited, quiet and steady, until one day it would reshape the world. For tonight, let it reshape only your imagination gently, as we prepare to drift into Chapter 2. When Columbus left Genoa more often, the sea became both his teacher and his companion. Each voyage in his late teens and early 20s stretched him farther, tested him against new winds, and taught him lessons he carried quietly, like smooth stones in a pocket. You can picture him now, standing among older sailors, his hands raw from rope, his ears tuned the way men judge weather by scent alone. They would tilt their faces into the air, inhale, and know whether storms were coming. Columbus imitated them, a quiet observer in the shadows, his mind storing the smallest details. In those years, he traveled to ports like Chios in the Aegean, and even up toward England and possibly Iceland, if later accounts are to be believed. Imagine him on deck, wrapped in a rough cloak against northern winds, staring at seas more gray than blue, seas that felt heavier, slower, almost reluctant to part for wooden ships. There is a calming thought here, that even someone destined to change maps first spent years just learning to listen to water's moods, to understand that the ocean has more patience than any man. Stay with me. We'll pause now in Lisbon, Portugal, where Columbus eventually settled for a time. Lisbon in the late 15th century was a place of golden light on whitewashed walls, of church bells and narrow streets, where sailors carried stories like treasures. This was a city obsessed with exploration. Ships left its harbor not just to trade, but to discover. Portugal had already reached down the coast of Africa, mapping stretches of land unknown to Europeans. To Columbus, Lisbon must have felt like a hearth for his ambitions, warming ideas he had once whispered only to himself. In Lisbon, he married Filipa Moniz, the daughter of a noble family connected to the Order of Christ, a religious order deeply tied to Portugal's voyages. Their life together was modest, perhaps quieter than you'd expect for a man who would chase horizons. They had a son, Diego, and for a time Columbus lived like any young father, balancing work, dreams, and the responsibilities of home. Picture him at supper, eating salted fish and bread, his wife beside him, their child sleeping in a corner. Outside, waves folded onto the beach, steady and unhurried. History often skips this domestic calm, but it mattered. It was here he learned to weigh duty against longing. At night, though, the sea always called him back. He studied maps obsessively, not only those of Europe, but also copies of ancient writings. He read about the theories of lands across the Atlantic, ideas preserved from scholars like Ptolemy, and whispers carried by merchants. He believed the world was smaller than most thought, that one could reach Asia by sailing west. It was not an idea entirely new, but in Columbus it ignited into something larger, something unshakable. Let's breathe slowly here and look over his shoulder as he studies those maps. The parchment is stiff, the ink faded, yet he traces lines with a fingertip, whispering, Sapangu, the old name for Japan, Cathay, the term for China. To him, these were not distant myths, but destinations almost within reach. Imagine the soft scrape of quill on parchment, the rustle of pages as he turns, the faint scent of tallow candles burning low. And now the curiosity loop. How did this quiet Genoese sailor persuade kings and queens to support such a dream? The answer begins here in Lisbon, where he started to shape his conviction into a plan. He watched Portuguese ships push ever farther south along Africa, searching for a route eastward. Columbus thought, why not west? It was a reversal so simple that others dismissed it as folly. But Columbus held on. Stay with me a little longer, because this is where the patience of his youth, the stillness at maps, becomes strength. While others hurry to prove themselves in quick voyages, he bided time, writing, calculating, imagining. He believed Asia lay closer across the Atlantic than it did by circling Africa. And though he was mistaken about distances, his certainty gave him courage enough to ask. Years passed. He petitioned the Portuguese crown, but they declined. Imagine the disappointment. After nights of careful preparation, he heard no. Yet instead of breaking, he simply adjusted his sails. He looked to Spain, then still forming its identity under Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus traveled there, weary from rejection, carrying nothing but conviction and the stories he could weave. Pause with him now in the small town of Palos de la Frontera in southern Spain. He walks through dusty streets, the scent of oranges in the air, the low hum of church bells marking evening. He carries a satchel filled with maps and dreams, his son perhaps holding his hand. He does not yet know that these streets will be remembered as the starting point of something vast. He only knows that he must keep asking, keep waiting, keep hoping that someone will believe. It's comforting, isn't it, to think of him this way? Not yet the Columbus of textbooks, but a man balancing patience, doubt, and longing. You may have known moments like that yourself, when something inside you insists there is more beyond the horizon, though the world around you seems unconvinced. He carried that contradiction like a lantern through dim corridors, steady but never hurried. In a moment, Will watch as his path finally aligns with the Spanish monarchs, as years of stillness prepare him for a voyage that would alter more than he ever expected. But before that, let's sit with him one last time in Lisbon. It is night. His wife is gone now, passed too soon, and Diego sleeps nearby. Columbus sits alone with parchment, quill in hand, the flame of his lamp bending as if listening. He whispers names again, Cipangu, Cathay, the Indies. He does not yet see the Americas. He only sees a path westward, glowing faintly across the dark Atlantic. That glow, quiet but persistent, is enough to guide him into the next chapter of his life, and ours. When Columbus first set foot in Spain, his shoes scuffed against roads that had only recently known peace. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had united their crowns, binding two kingdoms into one. Their court, heavy with silks and murmured Latin prayers, was alive with the idea of empire, but also burdened by war debts. Columbus entered their world not as a nobleman, but as a foreigner, a dreamer with sea-salted clothes and ideas too big for his pocket. Stay with me here, because the picture is not what you might expect. We often imagine him sweeping into grand halls, but the truth was slower, quieter. He spent years waiting, shuffling between monasteries and small towns, speaking with friars who had influence at court. Picture him seated across from a monk in a cool stone cloister, the sound of doves echoing through the arches. He unrolls his maps, his hands trembling slightly as he explains that Asia lies just west across the ocean. The friar listens, frowns, and then nods. Some believed him. Most did not. This patience became his life. He was, in many ways, homeless, wandering between hopes, holding his son's hand as they waited for audiences that often never came. Yet he did not release the dream. And here's the gentle twist. The very delays that seemed like failures gave him time to sharpen his story. Each rejection was a rehearsal. Each silence in the crown gave him room to perfect his calculations, his metaphors, his way of making the impossible sound inevitable. Breathe with me. Imagine Columbus walking to the courtyard of the Alhambra in Granada in 1492. The war against the Moors had ended. Spain had taken the city, and the monarchs were finally turning eyes outward, toward seas and trade. The air smelled of pomegranates and dust. The fountains whispered in Arabic patterns. Columbus waited, and at last his request aligned with their ambition. Ferdinand and Isabella, cautious but intrigued, agreed to fund his voyage, not with riches at first, but with just enough ships, just enough men, just enough faith to see if he was right. You can picture the relief washing over him. For nearly a decade he had wandered, doubted, petitioned. Now, suddenly, a path lay open. Yet, instead of celebration, there must have been quiet disbelief. Was this real, or would it collapse again? He walked slowly, the parchment of agreements tucked inside his satchel, his breath steady but shallow. Even now, he had convinced crews, gather supplies, prepare ships. Nothing about it was easy. Let's linger in Palos once more, because this little port would soon be etched into memory. The townsfolk were skeptical. Few wanted to risk sailing into what they still called the Sea of Darkness, the ocean thought to stretch endlessly west. But Columbus persuaded, coaxed, even borrowed prisoners from jails to fill out the crews. 3 ships were chosen, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They were not mighty vessels, not grand fleets, just modest caravels and a carrack, their wooden ribs creaking already before they left the harbor. Stay with me, because this moment matters. Picture the night before departure, August 2nd, 1492. Columbus walks the quiet streets of Palos, lantern in hand. He hears dogs barking, the faint strum of a lute from a tavern, the sea's steady breathing beyond the houses. He stops at the edge of the harbor. There, the ships rock gently, ropes groaning against moorings. The moon paints silver lines on the water. He closes his eyes, inhales, and for a heartbeat feels only calm. Tomorrow, everything changes. There is something soothing about imagining the crew, too. Some were frightened, some hopeful, some resigned. They packed bread, dried beans, wine, salted meat. Nothing luxurious, just provisions to carry them into uncertainty. On deck, barrels thudded as sailors rolled them aboard, voices low, movements unhurried. Columbus oversaw it all, his lantern throwing soft circles of light across wood and canvas. The night felt endless, and yet morning came as it always does, with a blush of pale orange over the horizon. And so, on August 3rd, 1492, the ship slipped from the harbor, sails catching the first breath of morning wind. The townsfolk watched silently, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers. Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, one hand on the rail, eyes fixed west. He did not shout, did not make a grand gesture. He simply leaned into the sea's rhythm, steady as ever, as if it always belonged to this crossing. Let's pause with him on deck in those early days. The ocean was still familiar, close to shore, gulls trailing the ships. The men worked in routine, tightening ropes, patching sails, laughing quietly as they adjusted the voyage. But beneath the calm, there lingered the question, how far would they go? How long could supplies last? Columbus answered with confidence, though inside, he must have wondered too. And yet, remember the boy bent over maps, whispering names like a lullaby. That boy had grown into this captain, and though the ocean ahead stretched wider than his calculations allowed, he carried the same conviction. The sea was no longer a dream. It was under his feet, rocking him into history. Stay with me, because the story of his voyage will unfold slowly in the next chapters, one tide at a time. For now, we leave them at sea, the horizon soft and endless, sails swelling with promise, the memory of Europe fading behind. The lanterns on deck flicker. The men murmur in low voices. Columbus gazes west, not knowing that within weeks, his name will be woven forever into the fabric of time. For now, he only feels the salt wind in his hair and the endless hush of water beneath. The ship slid farther from Spain, and soon the familiar coast disappeared. At first, the men could still imagine land behind them, the scent of orange groves and stone villages lingering in memory. But as days passed, only the horizon remained smooth and unbroken. Picture it. Endless water shifting between blue and gray, the sails creaking, gulls slowly vanishing until it was only sky and sea. For Columbus, this was not frightening but confirming. He had long dreamed of this silence, the ocean stretching as far as imagination could wander. The crew, though, was less at ease. Many had never sailed so far, without sight of land. They whispered in corners, muttered about the sea of darkness, about monsters painted on old maps. Columbus, aware of their fears, moved among them with calm words. He explained the stars, the trade winds, the currents. He reassured them that the sea had its patterns, just as land had roads. And in this quiet, he used not bravado but patience. That was his gift. He could make the unknown sound familiar. Stay with me, because here's something gentle but important. Columbus did not cross the Atlantic by accident. He understood the winds that circle the ocean. The trade winds carried them west, steady and reliable, almost as if the world itself leaned forward to help. Imagine standing on deck, the breeze pressing against your face day after day, the sails taut, the ship gliding as if drawn by invisible hands. The men grew accustomed to the rhythm. Meals of dried bread and salted meat became routine. They drank wine from barrels, shared jokes in low tones, and sang songs to fill the night air. Yet time at sea stretches strangely. A week feels like a month, and a month like a year. Each sunrise looks like the last, each wave a mirror of the one before. The men began to grow restless. They grumbled that they were sailing too far, that Asia would never appear. Columbus answered with confidence, though inside he must have felt the same unease. Still, he measured the days, recorded distances, and adjusted sails with practiced calm. His logbook became his lantern in the dark, each word an anchor to order. Let's pause in the middle of the Atlantic, under a night sky. The stars blaze brighter than they ever do on land, sharp and infinite. The sailors lie on deck, staring upward, their minds drifting between fear and wonder. Columbus, too, looks at those constellations, guiding the ships by patterns older than memory. You can almost hear the quiet, only the groan of timbers, the whisper of wind, and the steady rush of water. It is a lullaby, though for minutes sometimes sounded like eternity. And then a curious moment arrived. The compass, their trusted guide, seemed to drift strangely. The North Star did not align as expected. To the sailors, this was terrifying. Proof, they thought, that the sea itself was unnatural. But Columbus reassured them again, suggesting gentle explanations, promising they were still on course. This is one of those small, easily forgotten details, yet shows a skill. He calmed fear not by denying it, but by folding it into the rhythm of the voyage, as one folds a wrinkle into a blanket and smooths it flat. Stay with me, because just when doubt seemed strongest, signs of land began to appear. Weeds floated on the water, torn branches drifted past, and once a bird flew overhead. The men leaned over rails, staring, whispering prayers. Columbus smiled quietly. To him, these were the hints he had been waiting for. He reminded them gently, land was near. And though days still stretched on, the hope now felt tangible, like a candle flickering in a darkened room. Imagine the mood shifting. Voices softened, laughter returned. Even the food seemed to taste better with the thought that it might soon be freshened on new shores. Columbus continued to record, to reassure, to stand at the helm as if the ocean were simply a longer version of the Mediterranean he had known as a boy. This is the heart of it. He transformed fear into patience, silence into promise. Breathe slowly with me here, because we are approaching a night that will be remembered. October 11th, 1492. The ships had been at sea for more than 2 months. The men were weary, half believing, half despairing. But as the evening deepened, the sea carried whispers of change. The waves felt different, lighter. The air smelled faintly of land, grass, perhaps, or trees unseen. A lookout on the pinna thought he saw a flickering light, like a lantern far off. Some doubted, some believed. Columbus stood quietly, watching the horizon. And then, just before dawn, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, cried out that he saw land. Imagine the surge of voices, the rush of footsteps, the pounding of hearts. Yet even then, Columbus stayed measured. He waited until daylight confirmed it. And when the sun rose, painting the sky in soft orange and rose, there it was, shoreline, green and shimmering, waiting after weeks of nothing but sea. The men wept, laughed, knelt in prayer. Columbus closed his eyes, letting the sound of their relief wash over him. He had promised them land, and now land lay before them. But here's the quiet truth. He thought he had reached islands near Asia, perhaps Japan or the Indies. He did not know this was an entirely different world, vast and layered, filled with peoples and histories of its own. For the moment, none of that was clear. What mattered was the sight of land rising from the water, the proof that patience had carried them across. Stay with me just a little longer tonight. As the ships drift closer, sails slackening in the dawn, the men gather at the rails, eyes wide, breaths shallow. The sea hums beneath them, steady and calm. Columbus stands tall at the bow, his hand shading his eyes. The world has opened, though he does not yet realize how wide. For now, there's only the hush of waves against sand, the rustle of palm leaves and morning wind, and the sound of his heart beating slowly, steadily, into history. The morning of October 12th, 1492, unfolded slowly, like a curtain rising on a stage. The sea was calm, the air thick with the scent of salt and greenery. After weeks of nothing but water, the men leaned over the rails, their eyes wide with disbelief. There was land, soft and green, fringed with palms, shimmering in the morning light. They whispered prayers, crossed themselves, and clutched the rails as though the island might vanish if they blinked. Columbus, steady as ever, prepared to go ashore. He dressed carefully, for he knew this moment was not only about discovery, but also about ceremony. Picture him smoothing his tunic, adjusting the cloak on his shoulders, lifting a banner stitched with the emblems of Spain. His movements were deliberate, as though slowing himself might make the moment more real. Around him, sailors murmured like men waking from a long dream, their voices low, reverent. Stay with me here. The boats lowered into the water, which scraping softly against hulls, oars dipping in unison. The sea made small, rhythmic sounds like gentle breathing, as if welcoming them forward. Columbus sat quietly in the leading boat, his hand resting on the banner. He did not speak much, for words seemed unnecessary. The island drew nearer, pale sand, bright leaves, birds swooping above. It must have felt like entering a painting, a place imagined but suddenly tangible. When they touched shore, Columbus stepped onto the sand, the grains warm beneath his boots. He knelt and kissed the ground, whispering thanks. The men followed, some weeping, some laughing softly, some too stunned to do more than stare at the horizon. Columbus raised the banner, the fabric stirring in the breeze. He named the island San Salvador, though its true name had been spoken by others for countless years before him. And here, gently, we must notice something often overlooked. The island was not empty. People lived there, with lives rich in rhythms older than any European map. The Taino people emerged quietly from among the trees, curious, watchful. They carried no weapons, only open hands. Their skin shone in the sunlight, their hair dark against the green of the forest. They wore small ornaments of gold, which to Columbus gleamed like signals of promise. To the Taino, this moment was another kind of arrival, the sudden presence of strangers, their sails like wings, their clothing heavy and strange. Pause with me here. The two groups faced each other on the shore, the ocean at their backs, the forest before them. Neither spoke the other's tongue, but gestures bridged the silence. Smiles, offerings, cautious steps closer. The Taino gave parrots, woven cotton, and fruit. The Spaniards gave glass beads, brass bells, simple trinkets meant as signs of friendship. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers, fruit, and the salt of the sea. The only sound was the rustle of palm leaves and the distant cry of birds. Columbus, in his journal, described the people as gentle, generous, open. He believed they would make good allies, even subjects, though he already thought of their gold ornaments as clues to larger riches nearby. Yet in this moment, on this soft morning, there was more wonder than calculation. Imagine the men eating fresh fruit for the first time in weeks, the juice running over their hands, their bodies relaxing into the simple joy of nourishment. After salted meat and hard bread, this sweetness must have felt like a gift from the earth itself. Stay with me, because the scene carries more than history. It carries texture. The men waded into clear water, cool around their ankles, watching fish dart like flashes of silver. They sat in shade, listening to calls of birds they had never heard before, their notes bright and strange. Some wandered through the trees, marveling at blossoms the size of their palms. The Taino children laughed, pointing at the Europeans' clothing, tugging at sleeves with curiosity. The Spaniards, weary from months of sameness, laughed too, their faces softening into something like peace. For Columbus, though, the mind did not rest. He believed he had reached islands on the edge of Asia, perhaps near Cipangu. He asked often about gold, gesturing with his hands, showing coins and ornaments. The Taino, eager to please, pointed toward other islands. And so the dream carried him forward again. Yet beneath that ambition was still the wonder. A world so alive, so unlike the weary ocean, that even his hardened sailors felt like children discovering something new. As evening came, the air grew cooler, and the men built small fires on the sand. The glow lit their faces, shadows flickering across the palm trunks. They shared food with the islanders, their voices mixing in songs that did not share words but share rhythm. The sea lapped quietly nearby, stars unfolding above. After so many nights of endless horizon, they now had trees rustling in the dark, the smell of earth, the sense of shelter. Some men slept on the sand without fear, lulled by the strangeness of safety. Breathe slowly with me here, because this day, the first step onto San Salvador, was not just an event but a turning of pages. The world had shifted, though the men did not yet see how far. For now, it was enough to sit by the fire, to listen to the surf, to feel the softness of land beneath weary bodies. Columbus gazed into the flames, his thoughts drifting between gratitude, calculation, and the endless horizon of what might come next. The islanders, too, must have felt the strangeness of this night. Strangers by the fire, their sails folded in the harbor, their eyes fixed on stars. No fear yet, no anger, only curiosity, a shared moment before the long-waited history unfolded. For us, listening centuries later, it is a scene to hold gently, a meeting under palm trees and firelight on a night that whispered both wonder and consequence. Stay with me one moment longer. The fire crackles softly, the men's voices drift into murmurs, the Taino hum their own songs, and the ocean breathes steadily in the background. Above, the stars gleam like they did on the crossing, but now the scent of fruit and earth mixes with the salt air. Columbus closes his eyes for a moment, hearing not waves but the rustle of leaves. Tomorrow, exploration will begin again, but tonight they rest together on the edge of a new world. The days after that first landing unfolded like pages in a dream, soft and filled with discovery. Columbus and his men rose each morning to the sound of birds whose cries were unlike any they had heard in Europe, sharp and musical, echoing through the palm groves. The air was heavy with warmth, carrying the scent of flowers, fruit, and earth, so different from the salted bread and damp which smelled the ships. The men stretched their limbs on the sand, marveling at how steady the ground felt after months of rocking seas. For a little while, it seemed as if they had stepped into a world that existed solely to soothe their weariness. The Taino people watched curiously, approaching without fear, their gestures open, their laughter light. They brought fresh fruit, cotton cloth, and parrots with brilliant feathers, each offering made with ease that made the Spaniards feel both welcomed and humbled. Columbus accepted their gifts with measured smile, giving beads and trinkets in return, though his mind circled always back to the gold he glimpsed in their ornaments. He asked again and again, pointing toward rings, gesturing toward the horizon, and the Taino, eager to please, pointed outward other islands, each gesture widening the horizon of his ambition. Stay with me here, because the rhythm of these first days was not only about treasure, but about wonder. The sailors wandered inland, finding streams so clear they could see fish darting beneath their feet. They tasted fruits with juices that spilled sweet and sticky down their chins, the freshness startling after so many weeks of salted provisions. They lay in grass beneath trees taller than church towers, listening to leaves rustle in breezes that sounded like whispers. Columbus wrote in his journal that the land was the most beautiful he had ever seen, and it is soothing to imagine him pausing, quill in hand, to watch the light falling golden to the canopy, the world alive in colors he could scarcely describe. The men laughed again, their voices no longer tight with fear, but softened by the relief of abundance. Even the parrots seemed to join in, their wings flashing green and red as they swept through the sky. The Taino people moved easily through this landscape, teaching the sailors how to gather food, how to weave fibers, how to enjoy what the island already gave freely. To Columbus and his men, who had spent months rationing dry biscuits and wine, this generosity felt almost magical. They marveled at how the islanders lived without armor, without iron weapons, and yet seemed unafraid. In Columbus's eyes, this was a sign of openness, of innocence. He wrote that they would make fine friends, even fine subjects, though beneath his calm admiration lingered the calculations of a man already thinking of empire. And yet, in these first days, the feeling was still one of quiet discovery, of small steps into a place that felt like paradise. Imagine sitting at the edge of a stream as the sun sets, your feet in cool water, the trees glowing amber in fading light, the voices of new companions humming like a lullaby in the background. As the ships explored the coasts of nearby islands, the men found each new shore as welcoming as the last. They sailed short distances, their sails full with easy winds, and landed on beaches where the sand was pale as flour and the forests alive with fragrance. At each landing, the Taino greeted them with gifts and songs, their communities open, their huts clean and airy, woven from wood and palm leaves that swayed gently in the wind. The Spaniards walked among gardens of cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes, marveling at how the islanders cultivated without plows, relying on rhythms passed down through generations. Columbus saw in all of it both beauty and opportunity, the land generous and the people generous too. The sailors wrote back that they had never seen such abundance, and their fear of the ocean's emptiness faded into awe at the earth's fullness. Stay close, because there is a quiet contradiction here. For the sailors, the days felt like reprieve, like rest after a long trial. They ate, they slept, they laughed, they grew strong again under the sun. For Columbus, though, each hour was also a question, each sight of gold in an earring or necklace another spark that drew his mind farther. He asked the Taino again and again where the gold came from, and each time they pointed further west, toward larger islands, toward Cuba, toward Hispaniola. It is gentle to imagine his mind as a compass, always turning outward, even as his body lingered in the calm of each island. The men might sit by fires, savoring roasted fish and fruit, while Columbus stared into the flames, his thoughts already sailing beyond the horizon. At night, the camps were filled with sound, fires crackling, drums softly beating, voices weaving together in songs had been sung on the islands long before strangers arrived. The Spaniards listened, sometimes joining with their own tunes, their voices clumsy but warm. The stars above glittered with the same clarity they had seen on the ocean, but now the fragrance of earth mixed with salt and the sound of waves blended with the rustle of trees. It must have felt to many of them like a kind of peace, a balance between two worlds for a fleeting moment. Columbus, quill in hand, wrote by firelight, his script steady, his word a mixture of wonder and intention. He described the people as affectionate and generous, repeating how easily they gave what they had, how trusting they seemed. He praised the land as fertile, as ripe for planting, as filled with potential. And beneath his words, the current of ambition flowed, quiet but unrelenting. Imagine lying on the sand with the sailors, listening to the ocean's steady rhythm, the warmth of the fire at your feet, the coolness of night on your face. The voices of the Taino drift across the clearing, gentle and steady, like lullabies rising with the smoke. The stars lean close, endless and silent, and for a moment there is no fear, no distance, only the hum of life shared. In those days, before misunderstandings deepened, there was still the fragile wonder of first contact, of strangers sharing firelight under the same sky. Columbus, gazing into the flames, must have felt both comfort and urgency, knowing that each gift of food or ornament pointed him farther, promising a path to riches that seemed always just beyond the next horizon. Stay with me one breath longer. The island breeze cools your face, the fire glows steady, the forest hums in the dark. The men drift into sleep, their bodies heavy with relief. The Taino laugh softly nearby, their song still weaving into night air. Columbus writes until fire burns low, his quill scratching quietly, his thoughts already setting sail. Tomorrow, another island will rise on the horizon, and the pattern will begin again. But for tonight, it is enough to rest here on the sand, with the scent of fruit and salt, the glow of fire, and the promise of new shores just beyond the edge of morning. The horizon opened wider as the days passed, and Columbus, ever restless, guided his ships beyond San Salvador toward larger lands of Taino, described with sweeping gestures. The men followed, their sails swelling with steady winds, the ocean beneath them gentler than it had been in the vast crossing. Ahead, green silhouettes rose slowly from the water. Shores broader, mountains rising like soft shadows against the sky. It was Cuba, though to Columbus's mind it might have been the edge of Sapangu or even the coast of Cathay itself. He leaned at the prow of the Santa Maria, his eyes bright with conviction, his hand resting on the railing as though he could steady the dream into reality. The sailors, weary but curious, whispered that they had truly reached Asia, their imagination stirred by tales of Marco Polo and lands filled with gold and spices. For them, the horizon was no longer endless ocean but promise, solid and visible. When they anchored and set foot on Cuban soil, the earth felt firmer, richer, and the air heavy with the scent of forests that stretched deeper than the men could fathom. The Taino who lived there welcomed them with the same open generosity as those before, bringing food, tobacco leaves that they burned into curling smoke, and small ornaments of gold that gleamed in the sunlight. Columbus accepted these with solemnity, but within he felt the tightening of anticipation. Each piece of gold seemed to him a clue, a thread leading further, proof that he was indeed nearing the riches of Asia. The men marveled at the huts built in circles, at the fields of maize, at the simple tools and the ease with which the islanders lived. But Columbus's gaze always searched for the glint of metal, the hint of mines, the whisper of treasure waiting just beyond sight. Stay with me, because there was also wonder here that had nothing to do with ambition. The sailors lay on the soft ground, tasting fruits that burst with sweetness, watching flocks of parrots rise like living rainbows into the air. They wandered along rivers where fish flashed silver and blue, and they stood in awe of trees so tall that their crowns seemed to touch the sky. Columbus, too, paused in moments of stillness, his quill moving across parchment as he described the beauty of the land, calling it the most fertile, the most delightful he had ever seen. You could imagine him sitting beneath a tree, the shade cooling his face, the sound of wind in the leaves above him like a lullaby. He wrote by the steady flicker of a candle at night, recording details of plants and people, of rivers and skies, his script a mixture of observation and conviction. And yet, beneath the wonder, doubt stirred. The land was beautiful. But where were the cities of gold he had imagined? Where were the palaces, the silks, the jewels? He asked again, gesturing with coins and ornaments. And again the Taino pointed farther, always farther, toward an island they called Ayatai, which we know as Hispaniola. Columbus took each answer as confirmation, his mind certain that every gesture westward was proof he was on Asia's shore, only steps away from the kingdoms of the great Khan. The men believed him, too, for he spoke with such calm certainty, such soothing conviction, that even their doubts folded beneath his voice. As the days turned to weeks, the ships sailed along the Cuban coast, the shoreline shifting from beaches to forests to mountains. The men fished in quiet coves, their nets heavy with catch, and they roasted the fish over small fires, the smoke rising into evening air. They tasted roots and fruits offered by the Taino, savoring flavors that made them close their eyes with gratitude. After months at sea, their bodies grew strong again, their spirits lifted by the generosity of the land. They listened to the Taino songs, their voices rising in gentle rhythms as the sun fell and the night opened, the stars pressing close overhead. In those nights, sleep must have come easily, lulled by the rustle of trees, the warmth of fire, and the hum of voices speaking words they did not understand but felt deeply all the same. Stay with me, because this is a gentle paradox. While the men rested, while the land cradled them, Columbus's mind never rested. Each morning he rose before dawn, standing on the shore as the sky brightened, scanning the horizon for signs of larger lands, for glimmers of the riches he believed must lie just ahead. He carried inside him the same boy who had once bent over maps in Genoa, whispering names like Sapangu and Cathay, and now he was certain he had reached them. He wrote in his log with conviction, claiming these lands for Spain, imagining how the monarchs would reward him. The dream carried him onward, always onward, even as the present moment offered so much quiet beauty. There is something soothing in picturing those mornings. Columbus walking the beach, his boots sinking into sand still cool from night, his breath slow in the humid air. Palm leaves sway above, the surf murmurs beside him, and the first light of day turns the water into silver. Behind him, the sailors stir awake, stretching, their laughter beginning again, their bodies rested. The Taino approach with food, smiling, their gestures open. In that moment, there is no rush, no fear, only the steady rhythm of dawn, of waves, of human voices blending. And yet, Columbus's gaze always returned to the horizon, to the dream that lay beyond. When at last the ships prepared to sail again, heading toward Hispaniola, the men felt both reluctance and excitement. They had grown comfortable on Cuba's shores, lulled by its fruit and shelter, but they trusted their captain's vision, trusted that greater wonders awaited. Columbus stood at the helm, the sails billowing above him, the wind pressing steady at their backs. The island shrank behind them, its forests fading into haze, its mountains dissolving into the horizon. Ahead, only the sea stretched blue and calm, and the promise of new shores waiting just beyond sight. Breathe with me here. The ships glide forward, the men lean against rails, the ocean sings its endless song. The parrots' cries fade behind them, replaced once more by the hush of waves. Columbus writes in his log, the ink glistening in the sun, his words calm, deliberate, filled with certainty. He does not know that he is not in Asia, that the dream he carries is mistaken. But in this moment the conviction is enough. It guides him as surely as the stars, steady and unwavering across the sea. For the men, there is comfort in his calm. And for us, centuries later, there is something soothing in imagining them drifting forward into the unknown, sails full, hearts lifted, lulled by the steady rhythm of discovery. The sea carried them softly westward until the outline of Hispaniola rose on the horizon, broad and mountainous, its peaks lifting against the sky like dark blue shadows in the morning haze. To the sailors, weary but filled with expectation, it seemed larger and more promising than any island they had yet seen. The air itself grew rich with new scents, earthy and floral, carried across the water by steady breezes. Columbus, standing at the helm, felt the pull of destiny in this land, convinced now more than ever that it arrived at the edges of Asia, a place filled with possibilities that stretched beyond his ability to write. As the ships approached, the shoreline unfolded into coves and harbors, sandy beaches and deep forests where parrots wheeled above the canopy like sparks of green and red flame. The men stared in silence, some whispering prayers, some smiling with relief, all sensing that this island would be different. When they landed, the ground beneath their boots was firm and fragrant with damp leaves. Streams trickled nearby, their waters clear as glass, and birdsong filled the air in a constant chorus. The Taino people of Hispaniola came forward, curious and welcoming, bringing food, cotton, and ornaments of gold. To Columbus, the sight of gold was a beacon, a glimmer of promise that confirmed all he had hoped. He wrote eagerly of it, noting every piece, every gesture toward mines and mountains. Yet in those first days, the atmosphere was still one of wonder and generosity. The sailors tasted fruits they had never known, guava, pineapple, papaya, the sweetness exploding on their tongues after months of salted rations. They lay beneath palm trees, their bodies at last loosened from the strain of the voyage, their laughter softer now, their voices carrying into the humid evening air. Stay with me here, because the rhythm of life on Hispaniola in those first weeks was filled with small, tender details. The Spaniards walked through villages where huts stood in neat circles, woven from palm and cane, open to the breeze. They marveled at the hammocks strung from posts, the cotton soft and cool against the skin, a way of sleeping that felt like floating. They watched the Taino cultivate cassava in fields, their movements practiced and unhurried, their lives attuned to the cycles of earth and season. At night, fires glowed in the clearings, and songs rose into the star-filled sky, voices weaving in patterns that lulled even strangers into a kind of peace. Columbus sat by these fires, writing by lamplight, his quill scratching softly across parchment as he recorded the land's beauty, the people's openness, and always the signs of gold that gleamed like a refrain through his thoughts. And yet, the harmony was fragile. One night, The Santa Maria ran aground on a reef, its timbers groaning and splitting under the weight of waves. The sailors scrambled to save what they could, carrying wood and supplies to shore. Columbus, though calm, knew the loss was heavy. The largest of his ships would never sail again. But the Taino, generous and eager to help, came with canoes to rescue the men, bringing food, offering shelter, guiding them into safety. Columbus, deeply moved by their kindness, saw in this both the gentleness of the people and the opportunity to establish a settlement. From the wreckage, with Taino assistance, the Spaniards built a small fort which Columbus named La Navidad. For it was near Christmas when the work was completed. The fort rose from timbers, simple but strong, a cluster of huts and walls that seemed to the men like a foothold in paradise. Breathe slowly here and imagine the scene. The fort nestled near the shore, its walls of palm and wood gleaming in the sunlight, its fires smoking gently into the air. Around it, the forest pressed close, green and alive, its rustling leaves carrying the sound of unseen birds. The Spaniards worked steadily, their tools tapping against wood, their voices low, while the Taino came and went bringing food, teaching them how to survive in this new land. For the sailors, weary from months at sea, the fort felt like safety, a place to rest, to breathe, to hope that the voyage had meaning beyond the endless horizon. They slept in hammocks strung from beams, swaying gently as the night wrapped them in warmth, the fire's glow painting soft light across their faces. Columbus, though, could not rest entirely. He wrote of La Navidad as the first outpost of Spain in these lands, a beginning that would grow into something far greater. He left a garrison of men to remain, promising they would be safe, protected by the kindness of the Taino. The men, though reluctant, agreed, comforted by the abundance around them, by the sense that this land would provide all they needed. Columbus reassured them with calm words, promising to return, his voice steady as the tide. In his heart, he already planned his journey back to Spain, to show the monarchs proof of what he'd found: gold, cotton, new peoples, new lands. He imagined their faces, their approval, their rewards. The dream had grown larger now, no longer just maps and whispers, but tangible shores and settlements. Stay with me, because there is a gentle poignancy in this moment. The fort of La Navidad stood as both hope and uncertainty, a fragile structure built of wreckage, trust, and ambition. The Taino moved among the Spaniards with openness, offering food and shelter, their songs rising at night in harmony with the ocean's lull. The sailors laughed again, their spirits lifted, their fears of the sea washed away by the abundance of land. And yet, beneath the calm, the future trembled quietly, unseen, as two worlds touched and entwined. For now, though, there was only the hush of waves on the shore, the flicker of firelight against palm trunks, the steady breath of men sleeping in hammocks, and the rustle of leaves overhead. Columbus walked the perimeter of the fort before sleeping, his gaze lifting to the stars, his heart already leaning toward the voyage home. In those final days on Hispaniola before his return to Spain, the island must have felt like both paradise and promise, the air heavy with fruit and song, the land alive with color and sound. Columbus wrote until his ink ran low, filling pages with descriptions of beauty and abundance, his words steady even in the glow of firelight. The men at La Navidad waved as the ships prepared to leave, their figures small against the palm trees, their voices carrying faintly across the water. The sails filled with wind, the ships leaned into the sea, and Hispaniola's green shores began to fade behind them. Columbus stood on deck, his eyes fixed eastward, carrying with him not only the memory of this place, but also the conviction that he had touched Asia's edge. The sea stretched before him again, calm and endless, a path homeward filled with certainty. For now, the fort stood, the island sang, and the dream carried him forward, steady as the waves. When the sails of the Nina and the Pinta filled again with wind, the ocean seemed to breathe with them, carrying Columbus's men eastward toward Spain. Behind them, Hispaniola faded into haze, its green mountains dissolving into the horizon, leaving only memory and promise. The fort of La Navidad remained with its small garrison, a fragile mark of Spain in a world that had not known such ships before. Columbus stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the salt air brushing his face. He carried with him journals filled with descriptions, samples of cotton, a few ornaments of gold, and above all the certainty that his voyage would be remembered. The men, lighter in spirit now, worked with steadier hands, their voices no longer tight with fear, but filled with the relief of land discovered, of survival proven, of riches perhaps just beyond reach. The return voyage, though, was not without trials. The Atlantic was no gentle cradle this time, but a restless companion. Storms gathered, winds howled, and the small ships groaned under the weight of waves. Imagine the Nina rising on swells as high as towers, crashing down with shudders that rattled timbers and hearts alike. The men clung to ropes, their prayers whispered into the spray, while Columbus steadied them with calm orders. He reassured them that the same winds which had carried them westward, in their turn, carried them home. And though his voice was steady, he too must have felt the tremor of uncertainty, the realization that discovery meant little if it could not be carried safely back to Spain. Stay with me here. The nights on that return voyage were filled with contrasts. The sea raging one moment, then softening into calm the next. Under starlight, the ships seemed small and fragile, lanterns swinging at the mast, their glow pale against the dark. The sailors, weary from storms, slept in turns, their bodies sway with the ship's rhythm, their dreams filled with palm trees and fruits, with fires on beaches, with the faces of the Taino who had welcomed them. Columbus, in those hours, wrote still, his quill scratching even as the ship creaked. He recorded the storms, the distance, the hope that Spain would believe him. His words were both prayer and proof, his way of anchoring the vastness into something that could be read and trusted. The sea, though, tested them deeply. A fierce storm near the Azores scattered the ships, leaving the Nina alone for days, tossed like driftwood across mountainous waves. Columbus vowed in those hours that if he survived, he would make pilgrimage in thanks. The men huddled together, their clothes soaked, their lips cracked with salt. And yet, in the lulls between storms, the ocean calmed again, stretching smooth and silver under moon, as if it wished to soothe what it had just shaken. It is gentle to imagine those moments, the men lying on deck, staring up at stars clear and sharp, their breath slowing, their hearts steadying after fear. The ocean, like life itself, was both fury and lullaby. At last, the battered ships neared Europe. The men spotted land, cried out with relief, and felt their bodies loosen from weeks of tension. Columbus, weary but composed, guided the Nina into port. The sails torn, the hull scarred, but the voyage complete. News of his return spread quickly. Word leapt from town to town, and soon he was summoned to court. Imagine him walking the stone corridors of Spanish palaces, his sea-worn clothes replaced with garments more fitting, though his hands still carried the salt of the ocean in memory. Ferdinand and Isabella awaited him, their court filled with nobles, priests, and advisers, all curious to hear what the Genoese sailor had brought back. Columbus bowed, presented his journals, the gold ornaments, the parrots, the cotton. He spoke with measured words, his voice calm, recounting not only the islands but also the people, their openness, their generosity, their willingness to trade. He spoke of endless forests, of fertile fields, of waters filled with fish. And always he returned to the glen of gold, to the promise of more just beyond reach. The monarchs listened, their eyes intent, their minds already weighing what it meant for Spain. They rewarded him with titles, with praise, with the promise of further voyages. For Columbus, who had once wandered from court to court with nothing but dreams, this was the moment of arrival, the proof that his persistence had not been in vain. Stay with me, because the scene itself is soft if you imagine it not as a grand proclamation, but as a quiet conversation between a weary sailor and two monarchs who had wagered on hope. The hall smelled faintly of incense and wax. The tapestries hung heavy on the stone walls, and outside, the bells of Spain rang in the evening air. Columbus spoke, his voice low but steady, and the room leaned in to listen. The parrots shifted on their perches, their feathers flashing, their cries startling in the silence. A hush lingered, filled with the awareness that something had shifted, though none yet understood how vast the change would be. And so Columbus, once a boy bent over maps by candlelight, had crossed the ocean and returned. He had stood on unknown shores, had built a fort from wreckage, had written words that would reshape maps. For now, though the story rests in this moment of return, of voices quiet in a Spanish hall, of lanterns flickering against stone, of a man's dream turned into memory and record. The ocean still called him, whispering of voyages yet to come. But tonight he slept in a bed again, the sound of waves replaced by the steady hush of his own breath. His men, too, scattered to taverns and homes, telling stories in soft voices, their eyes still wide from all they had seen. And beyond them, Spain itself began to dream larger, its gaze turning outward toward seas and islands that lay waiting. For now, the Nina rested in port, its sails lowered, its timbers scarred but strong, while the night covered the land in stillness. The return of Columbus to Spain was like the quiet arrival of a tide that soon swelled into a wave. His stories traveled quickly, whispered in taverns, written into letters, spoken in markets. People marveled that the Atlantic, which for centuries had been feared as endless and unknowable, had been crossed and revealed to hold lands rich with forests, rivers, and people. For the monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, it was not only marvel but opportunity. They had risked much in granting him ships, and now he returned with proof. Parrots with bright feathers, cotton, gold ornaments, and words that painted islands of abundance. The decision was made swiftly. A second voyage, larger, better supplied, with the weight of empire behind it. Columbus, once the dreamer wandering from court to court with parchments under his arm, now stood as admiral of the ocean sea, with honors and resources that gave shape to his vision. Stay with me here, because the scale of the second voyage was entirely different from the first. Where once 3 modest ships had set out with anxious crews, now 17 vessels gathered in Cadiz in 1493, their masts rising like a forest of wood and rope against the sky. Over 1,000 men prepared to sail. Sailors, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, settlers. Supplies were loaded, horses, cattle, seeds, tools, all the elements of a colony rather than just an expedition. It was no longer a voyage of fragile hope, but a mission of expansion. The harbor bustled with energy, the smell of pitch and tar mixing with the salt air, the sounds of carpenters hammering, sailors shouting, priests chanting prayers. Columbus moved among them with quiet authority, his cloak brushing against planks, his voice low but firm as he oversaw preparations. He must have felt the weight of expectation pressing gently upon his shoulders, though he bore it with the same calm that had carried him across unknown seas. Imagine the night before departure. The ships rest at anchor, their lanterns glowing like stars reflected on water. The men sleep restlessly on deck, some excited, some fearful, the murmur of their voices drifting into the night. Columbus walks the quiet quay, his boots clicking softly against the stone, his gaze fixed on the masts that sway like dark silhouettes against the moonlit sky. He knows this voyage will be different. He knows he will not return simply as a discoverer, but as a leader of settlement, a builder of Spain's presence in lands that had lived without such strangers. He carries the memory of Hispaniola with him, the generosity of the Taino, the sweetness of fruit, the glimmer of gold. And in his heart, he promises himself to bring back more than proof this time. He promises permanence. And so, in September 1493, the fleet unfurled its sails and slipped out into the Atlantic once again. The sea, restless yet familiar, rose beneath them. This time there was less fear, for the men knew the ocean could be crossed. The winds carried them steady, the ships sailing in formation, their decks crowded with men who leaned over rails and stared into the endless blue. Columbus moved between ships, ensuring order, his journals filling once again with steady lines of ink. He wrote not only of distances and bearings, but also his thoughts, his vision of what awaited them. The days at sea were filled with routine. Ropes tightened, sails patched, meals of salted meat and bread taken at set hours. At night, voices drifted into song, the stars guiding them west as they had before. Yet this voyage carried a new hum of purpose, a weight heavier than discovery. Stay close, because the arrival was no less wondrous the second time. In November, the fleet reached the islands of the Caribbean once more. First Dominica, lush and green, then Guadeloupe, where they found fruits, streams, and canoes carved from single tree trunks. The men marveled again at the abundance, their eyes widening at the sight of forests and birds. Columbus recorded every detail, his words calm and precise, as though he were cataloging paradise itself. Yet he looked always toward Hispaniola, the heart of his plans, the island where he had left his men at La Navidad. As the ships approached Hispaniola, Columbus must have felt both excitement and unease. He had promised safety to the garrison, had spoken with calm assurance that the Taino's kindness would protect them. Now, as the shoreline grew larger, his eyes searched for smoke from the fort, for figures waiting at the shore. But when they reached La Navidad, the fort lay silent. The huts were burned, the timbers collapsed, the place deserted. The men he had left were gone. Slowly, the truth unfolded. The garrison had quarreled with each other, had taken more than they should, had angered the very people whose trust had been freely given. The Taino, pushed beyond patience, had struck back. And so La Navidad, the first Spanish settlement in the New World, was gone, its fires long cooled. Pause here with me. Imagine the stillness of that scene. The charred wood, the quiet shore, the forest rustling just beyond, holding its secrets. Columbus stood among the ruins, his men silent around him, the sound of waves breaking gently as though nothing had changed. He felt the weight of disappointment, the fragility of trust lost. Yet he did not despair. Instead, he turned his thoughts to rebuilding, to creating something stronger, something that could last. He ordered the construction of a new settlement, which he named La Isabela, after Queen Isabella, a town built of stone and wood, with streets and houses, a church and a storehouse. The men worked, their tools clinking in the hot sun, their voices carrying across the clearing. The Taino watched from a distance, wary now, their earlier openness dimmed. Breathe slowly with me here, because this moment carries both the softness of beginnings and the shadows of what would follow. La Isabela rose as a small town, the first of its kind in these islands, its huts lined in rows, its fires burning at night, its church bells echoing faintly into the forest. The men planted seeds, tethered livestock, tried to shape Europe in a land that had its own rhythm. They slept in hammocks strung under new roofs, their bodies weary but their spirits uncertain. For Columbus, the dream remained intact, though cracks had begun to show. He wrote still of abundance, of rivers filled with fish, of soil rich for planting, of gold always waiting just beyond reach. His words were steady, his conviction unbroken, but the silence of La Navidad lingered in his mind like the sound of waves in the dark. Stay with me one moment longer. The nights at La Isabela were filled with both hope and unease. Fires glowed in the streets, the ocean whispered beyond the shore, and the stars spread wide above, just as they had on the open sea. Columbus sat at his desk, quill in hand, writing by the light of a lantern, the rustle of palm leaves blending with the scratch of ink. He thought of Spain, of the monarchs, of the promise he had made to bring them a new world. Around him, the men slept uneasily, some dreaming of riches, others longing for home. The Tainos sang in the distance, their voices low and steady, carrying into night air like a reminder of the land's deeper story. For now, the town stood, the ships anchored, the dream alive, though its edges trembled in the shadows. The ocean breathed its lullaby, and Columbus, once more, prepared himself for what lay ahead. The new town of La Isabela stood at the edge of the sea, its houses of wood and stone lined in rows, its streets pressed into the earth by the tread of men and animals who had crossed an ocean to begin anew. At first it seemed a place of promise. Fires glowed at night, smoke rose into the humid air by day, and the sound of hammers echoed as walls were raised, barrels unloaded, and paths cut into surrounding forest. The men planted seeds brought from Spain, tethered horses and cattle, and built storehouses filled with supplies. The church bell rang with a steady tone, calling them to prayer, reminding them of the world they had left behind. To Columbus, the settlement was a vision made real, the first true town of Europe in these new lands, a foothold that could grow into empire. Yet the land had its own rhythm, and soon the men felt its weight. The soil, though rich, was unlike the earth of Castile, and their seeds struggled in the heat. The cattle weakened, the horses grew thin, the food spoiled more quickly than they had known. The men, unused to such climate, fell ill, their bodies heavy with fever, their skin damp with sweat that clung even at night. They lay in hammocks, restless and coughing, whispering that the island itself resisted their presence. The Taino, once so open and generous, now looked on with caution, their trust tempered by the memory of La Navidad and the quarrels of men who had not known how to live with gentleness. Columbus, calm in the face of difficulty, walked among his men, offering reassurance, speaking softly of patience, of faith, of the need to endure. He recorded the struggles in his journal, yet still described the land as beautiful, the rivers as full of fish, the forest as filled with promise. Stay with me here, because this part of the story carries a slower, heavier rhythm. The men had crossed the ocean on winds of hope, but in La Isabella hope often turned to frustration. Supplies ran thin, and quarrels broke out between sailors, soldiers, and settlers. Some longed to return home, their voices carrying at night through the humid darkness. Others grew restless with Columbus himself, whispering that his promises of endless gold had not yet been fulfilled. The Taino, too, grew uneasy as demand for food and labor increased, and the harmony of first encounters gave way to tension. Columbus tried to weave calm from the threads of discord, reminding all that patience was the compass that would guide them, yet beneath his steady words, he must have felt the tremor of doubt, the recognition that his dream was harder to shape into reality than it had been to carry across maps and stars. The forest pressed close against the town, alive with birds whose cries filled the air at dawn, with insects that sang through the long afternoons, with shadows that deepened as evening fell. The ocean breathed steadily, its waves breaking against the shore, a reminder of both distance and return. The men listened to these sounds as they lay in their hammocks, fevered or restless, their minds drifting between the comfort of Spain and the strangeness of this land. Columbus, in those hours, sat with his maps, his quill moving slowly as he wrote letters to the monarchs. He described not only the trials, but also the endless possibilities. The veins of gold he believed lay hidden in mountains, the fertile fields he swore could yield crops, the souls he promised could be guided into faith. His words, measured and calm, reached across the ocean, a bridge of ink that carried his conviction even when the town around him wavered. And yet, amidst the illness and quarrels, there were still moments of wonder. The sailors wandered along rivers shaded by trees, so tall they seemed to touch the sky. They tasted new fruits that dripped sweetness down their chins, their bodies revived by the freshness of the land. They watched the Taino paddle sleek canoes across the water, their movements smooth and silent, the boats gliding like shadows over glass. They listened to songs that rose in the night air, voices steady and soft, weaving rhythms that carried far beyond words. For a while, these sounds soothed them, as though the land itself still offered comfort, even as it resisted their attempts to tame it. Stay close, because Columbus himself, though burdened with leadership, still felt the same awe he had carried since his first steps ashore. He rose at dawn to walk the beach, his boots sinking into the sand, the horizon painted pink and gold with the rising sun. He breathed deeply of the humid air, his eyes fixed on the mountains inland, convinced that riches waited there. He prayed quietly, his words blending with the sound of waves, asking for strength, for patience, for guidance. And when he returned to the town, he moved with the same calm that had steadied his men on the Atlantic, his voice quiet, his gestures deliberate, his conviction unshaken. La Isabella, though fragile, endured those first months. Fires burned at night, the bells still rang, the men still labored. They built houses with stone foundations, stronger than those of La Navidad. They carved roads through the forest, sent small expeditions inland, and marked maps with rivers and valleys. They endured fever and hunger, endured quarrels and doubt, endured the weight of a dream that had seemed light on the waves but grew heavy on land. Columbus guided them with the same patience that had once carried him as a boy tracing maps by candlelight. He knew that discovery was only the beginning, that settlement was slower, harder, more testing. He bore it with steady heart, though he must have felt the strain deep within. Breathe slowly with me here, because the image of La Isabella at dusk lingers gently in the mind. The sun sinks behind mountains, painting the sky in orange and violet. The fires of the town glow softly, smoke rising into the humid air. The ocean murmurs against the shore, the forest hums with insects, and the voices of men drift in tired conversation. Some sit outside huts, their hands busy with nets, their eyes distant. Others rest in hammocks, the fabrics swaying lightly, their breath evening out as sleep finds them. Columbus sits at a table lit by lantern, his quill scratching slowly, his face thoughtful. He pauses, lifts his gaze to the stars beyond the palm leaves, and breathes. For a moment, All is quiet, all is still, the world resting between the weight of struggle and the whisper of promise. From ashore at La Isabella, the mountains always rose in distance, their shapes softened by mist, their slopes dark with forests that seemed endless. To Columbus, they looked less like obstacles and more like promises, because he believed, with the certainty of a man who had built his life upon conviction, that gold waited there. The town, with its illnesses and quarrels, could not soothe his restless spirit. His eyes were always drawn inland, where rivers cut valleys, and where Taino guides whispered of yellow metal found in streams. He gathered small parties of men, armed and weary but willing, and set out toward the interior, leaving behind the smell of salt air and the hush of waves. The path was slow, winding through thickets where leaves brushed their faces, through humid air that clung to their skin, through streams that cooled their feet before they climbed again. The land was lush, filled with sound that never ceased. Birds cried above them, insects droned, and the wind rustled branches so high overhead it seemed like another world entirely. The men stumbled on roots, gasping in the heat, their clothes soaked with sweat, but their eyes widened at sights unlike anything in Spain. Trees taller than towers stretched skyward, vines hung in tangled curtains. Flowers bloomed in colors so bright they seemed to glow. Streams ran cold and clear, flashing silver where sunlight touched them. The Taino guides moved with ease, their bodies flowing to forest as though it welcomed them, pointing at plants for food, to roots that eased thirst, to paths invisible to European eyes. The Spaniards followed, both humbled and unsettled, their boots heavy, their breath loud in a land that seemed to swallow sound. Stay with me here, because it is in these quiet details that the story finds its rhythm. Imagine Columbus pausing by a river, the water rushing over smooth stones, the sun gleaming on flecks of gold that glimmered like stars caught in current. He bent down, scooped water in his palm, and held it to his lips, his gaze fixed on the shimmer. To him it was proof, small, fragile, but enough to spark conviction. He straightened, his eyes alight, and spoke calmly to his men of riches waiting deeper in the island, of mountains filled with promise. The men listened, their bodies weary but their minds stirred by hope. They collected small nuggets, pressed them into pouches, and felt their spirits rise, soothed by the idea that their struggle was not in vain. The journeys inland stretched over days. They built camps by rivers, lighting fires whose smoke drifted into the night sky. The men lay in hammocks or upon mats, listening to hum of the forest, the crackle of flames, the distant cries of unseen animals. Columbus wrote by the firelight, his quill steady, recording the mountains, the rivers, the glimpses of gold. His words were filled with calm assurance, each sentence a thread tying the unknown into something tangible. He described the Taino as guides who move like shadows, their kindness evident in every gesture, their songs soft in the night air. For Columbus, the forest was not only a place of struggle but also of wonder, and his journals reflected both, the difficulty of the march and the beauty of the world unfolding before him. As they pressed farther inland, they encountered villages where the Taino welcomed them with food, cassava bread, roasted fish, fruits that dripped juice onto the men's beards. The Spaniards marveled at the order of the villages, the clean huts, the woven hammocks, the gardens neat and full. They were offered cotton and small ornaments of gold, worn lightly by men and women who did not treat the metal as treasure, but as adornment, simple and beautiful. Columbus, though polite and measured, saw in each gift another sign of what could be found if one searched deeper. He asked, always, where the gold came from, and the people gestured again toward the mountains, always pointing farther, always outward. Breathe slowly here. Picture the men moving along a valley where mist drifted in low veils, the ground damp beneath their boots, the air cool with the scent of rain. Birds darted among branches, their feathers flashing blue and yellow, their calls echoing through the trees. The Spaniards moved in silence, humbled by the immensity of the landscape, while Columbus, at the front, kept his eyes on the ridges that seemed to lift higher with each step. He believed that beyond each ridge lay more rivers, more gold, more proof that his vision was true. The men followed, some with faith, others with doubt, but all soothed by the slow rhythm of marching through beauty. The forest embraced them, its sounds weaving into a lullaby that steadied even weary hearts. At night, the camps glowed with firelight. Sparks rose into the sky, carried upward like prayers, and the men lay back to watch stars emerge through gaps in the canopy. The Taínos sang softly, their voices blending with the forest hum, and the Spaniards listened, lulled by rhythms they did not know but felt. Columbus, riding at the edge of the fire, looked from page to sky, his eyes reflecting both flame and starlight. He thought of Spain, of the monarch's awaiting word, of the fortune he was certain lay just ahead. And yet, even he must have felt the quiet wonder of the forest, its vastness, its beauty, its refusal to be tamed quickly. For all his ambition, he was still a man under the stars, soothed by the same sounds as his men. In time, they gathered enough gold dust and ornaments to reassure themselves, if not to prove abundance. Columbus prepared to send word back to Spain, his letters filled with calm conviction that the island was rich, that the settlement could endure, that the future was as vast as the forest itself. He returned to La Isabela with his men, their steps slow but steady, their pouches heavier, their eyes carrying the memory of rivers and mountains that shimmered in sunlight. The town welcomed them with firelight and song, the sound of hammers and voices rising once more, the ocean breathing steadily beyond. Columbus walked the streets, his mind both restless and soothed, knowing that the dream was still alive, though its weight grew heavier with each day. Stay with me one breath longer. Picture him at dusk, standing at the edge of the settlement, gazing inland where the mountains lifted in dark silhouettes against a sky of fading gold. The town glowed behind him. The forest whispered ahead, and he stood between them, a man carrying both the burden of leadership and the wonder of discovery. The sea hushed at his back, the land pulsed before him, and for a moment, in the soft balance of evening, all seemed possible. La Isabela, though it stood with its streets traced into the earth and its walls raised from stone and timber, was never at ease. At first the men believed they had built a foothold that would carry Spain into the New World, but soon the rhythm of life there grew heavy. The air was thick with heat that pressed on their bodies day after day, and the rains came with sudden force, turning paths to mud, soaking roofs, and carrying sickness with them. The seeds they planted in neat furrows struggled in soil they did not yet understand, and when crops grew, the heat often withered them before harvest. Food became scarce, and the salted meat brought from Spain rotted in barrels, its smell rising sharp and sour in the humid air. The men grew restless, their stomachs empty, their patience fraying. At night they whispered home, of bread still warm from ovens, of wine cool in cellars, of fields that yielded grain without such endless labor. Columbus, steady in voice though burdened in thought, walked among them. He spoke of patience, of the riches that would come, of the faith that had carried them across the sea. He reminded them that every settlement begins with hardship, that Spain itself had risen from struggles, that time and endurance would bring reward. Some listened, their spirits soothed by his calm words, but others grumbled still, their eyes narrowing, their hands clenched. They had come seeking gold, seeking treasure that could be touched and carried, and instead they found sickness, hunger, and endless toil. Columbus recorded these troubles in his journals, careful to temper them with descriptions of beauty, of rivers and forests, of glimpses of gold, dust, and streams. He wrote with conviction, as though words themselves could steady the fragile settlement. Stay with me here, because within this unrest there were still moments of quiet beauty. The men sat at dusk by the ocean, watching the sun sink into waves, the sky painted with colors that softened their hearts. They walked into forests where orchids bloomed in silence, where streams cooled their weary feet, where the air smelled sweet with flowers they had never known. They listened to the Taíno songs at night, drifting across the distance, voices steady as the stars above. And though hunger pressed on them, though fevers left them weak, there was still the soothing rhythm of waves against the shore, of wind in the palms, of the earth breathing around them. For a little while, these sounds carried them back into hope, but the quarrels grew sharper. Some of the men challenged Columbus openly, doubting his promises, accusing him of leading them into ruin. Others demanded to return to Spain, their eyes hollow with longing. Columbus, though calm, must have felt the strain deeply. He was no longer only a sailor guiding ships across seas. He was now a governor of restless men in a fragile settlement. His every decision weighed against hunger and discontent. He tried to steady them with structure, appointing captains, dividing labor, setting rules. He ordered expeditions inland, hoping to find more gold, to give proof that their struggle was worth the hardship. Some expeditions returned with small nuggets, enough to stir hope, but not enough to silence doubt. The men whispered still, their voices low but constant, their patience stretched thin. The Taino, who had once given freely, now looked upon the settlement with cautious eyes. They brought food, but less often. They smiled politely, but their voices held distance. They had seen quarrels, seen demands grow heavier, seen men who did not always repay kindness with kindness. Trust trembled, fragile as the huts of palm and cane that swayed in the wind. Columbus knew this, and he tried to mend it, sending gifts, speaking softly, promising friendship. Yet he also sent men to demand food when supplies dwindled, and the balance grew uneven, the harmony fragile. The songs at night grew fainter, the distance between the settlement and the villages wider. Breathe slowly here, because in the stillness of those nights Columbus must have felt the weight of solitude. He wrote by lantern light, his quill scratching softly, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and damp wood. Outside, the men argued in low voices, their words drifting into the humid air. Beyond, the ocean murmured steadily, waves breaking with the same rhythm that had carried him across. He paused, dipped his quill, looked at the stars of the palm-framed sky, and breathed. He reminded himself that he had crossed what others feared to cross, that he had touched shores no one in Spain had believed reachable. Yet the dream was not as simple as discovery. It was settlement, and settlement required more than vision. It required endurance, patience, and harmony that he struggled to weave. Still the town lived. Fires burned at night, smoke curling into the sky. The bell of the church rang in the mornings, calling men to prayer, its sound echoing faintly across the shore. Expeditions went out, some returning weary, some carrying small signs of hope. Ships arrived from Spain with new supplies, new faces, new expectations. Each arrival stirred the settlement, lifting voices, renewing energy, though soon the same hardships pressed down again. The cycle of hope and weariness spun slowly, like the tide, never ending but always shifting. Columbus guided them as best he could, his voice calm, his hand steady, though the shadows under his eyes deepened. Stay with me one breath longer, because the image of La Isabella in those days is one of fragile persistence. Imagine huts glowing with lantern light at dusk, the fires flickering, the ocean beyond turning dark and endless. Men sit outside, their voices tired but steady, their eyes reflecting the flames. Columbus writes at his table, his face lit by candle, his thoughts carried both to Spain and to the mountains inland. The Taino moved quietly beyond, their songs distant now, but still rising into the night. The air is heavy, filled with both struggle and beauty, with both tension and calm. And in that balance, the settlement endures, fragile but alive, its story written one slow breath at a time. The months at La Isabella pressed on, and with them came new weight upon Columbus's shoulders. Though the town still stood, though the bells still rang and fires still burned, the murmurs among his men grew sharper. They had crossed the ocean on promises of gold and glory, and yet their days were filled instead with sickness, hunger, and endless toil under a sun that gave no mercy. Columbus had written to Spain of rivers with glimmering dust, of fertile soil and fields awaiting harvest, of people open to trade and friendship. But the letters carried more than truth. They carried hope shaped into words, and in Spain that hope grew larger than the reality could match. Ships arrived with new settlers, with priests and officials, each expecting to find abundance ready for them. Instead, they stepped into hardship, their faces quickly drawn, their voices tinged with complaint. Columbus, calm as ever, tried to reassure them, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering, but he could not silence every doubt. Stay with me here, because this tension was not loud at first. It was a low hum, like the sound of insects in the forest, constant and unyielding. The settlers questioned his leadership, whispered about his decisions, grumbled about the lack of treasure. Some accused him of hoarding knowledge, of promising too much, of being blind to the suffering around them. Others compared him unfavorably to the nobles who had come from Spain, men with titles and influence who thought themselves more fit to govern. Columbus, though admiral, was still a Genoese outsider in their eyes. His authority, granted by the crown, but not by their hearts. He felt the sting of their suspicion, but did not let it show. He walked among them calmly, offering words of patience, reminding them that every new beginning is heavy with hardship. His journals carried these thoughts too, the ink steady even when the voices around him were not. The Taino, who had once been so open, began to withdraw further. Their generosity had been strained by demands for food, for labor, for guidance. Some still brought gifts of fruit or fish, but their smiles grew thinner, their eyes wary. Columbus, aware of this shift, tried to mend it with gestures of friendship, with beads and trinkets, with words of peace. Yet the balance was fragile, and he knew it. He could sense the distance growing like a shadow at the edge of light. The songs that once carried into the night from villages nearby were quieter now, softer, as though the land itself was pulling back. Still, Columbus pressed onward, convinced that patience would mend what time had frayed. The sickness in the town grew worse. Fevers burned through the men, their bodies weakened, their spirits dulled. Many lay in hammocks, eyes half closed, their breath heavy in the humid air. The priests walked among them with prayers, sprinkling water, whispering blessings. The sound of coughing and moaning filled the nights, carried on the damp breeze that rustled the palms. Columbus himself felt ill at times, his body weakened, his strength sapped, but he forced himself to rise, to walk, to write, to speak with steady voice. He would not let the dream falter, not while it still lived in his heart. He believed that the hardships were tests, that beyond them lay the fulfillment of all he had promised. His conviction, though shaken in moments of solitude, never vanished. Breathe slowly here and picture the town at dusk. The fires flicker in the streets. The bell tolls softly. The ocean murmurs beyond. Men sit outside their huts, their faces lined with weariness, their voices low as they share what little food remains. The Taino stand at a distance, watching silently, their figures lit faintly by the glow of fire. Columbus writes by lantern light, his hand steady, his words shaping not only what he sees, but what he believes will come. He pauses to listen to the waves, to the faint hum of insects, to the sighs of his men, and he lifts his gaze to the stars, finding comfort in their steady light. For him, the stars were not only guides across the ocean, but reminders that even in darkness, direction can be found. Stay close, because the pressure from Spain itself grew heavier with each ship that arrived. Letters from the monarchs urged him to bring back more gold, to send reports of wealth that would justify the cost of so many ships and men. Columbus, knowing the truth was slower than expectation, still wrote with calm conviction. He described the land as fertile, the people as willing, the mountains as filled with riches yet to be fully uncovered. His words were a bridge of hope, carrying across the ocean to monarchs who wanted proof that their gamble had been wise. In Spain, his letters were read with excitement, and preparations for more voyages began. Though they did not see the fevered bodies, the hunger, the quarrels that filled the days at La Isabela. And yet, through all this, life continued. Expeditions still set out into the interior, men marching with guides along rivers, climbing into mountains, returning with small flecks of gold and stories of villages. They spoke of landscapes so beautiful, they forgot their hunger for a while, of waterfalls that roar like thunder, of forests alive with parrots that shone like jewels in the sky. These stories soothed the weary, even if they did not fill their purses. The land itself offered wonders beyond measure, and sometimes, sitting by fires at night, the men let themselves believe again. They leaned back, watched sparks rise into the humid air, and for a moment their hearts rested in the beauty of what surrounded them. Columbus, though burdened by doubts and demands, held to his dream. He had crossed the ocean when others said it could not be done. He had touched lands no European had known. He had built settlements, fragile though they were, and planted seeds of empire in soil that resisted but still yielded small signs of promise. He knew the dream was heavier now, but he carried it still, as steady as he had carried it since he was a boy with maps spread under lamplight. At night, he sat quietly, writing by candle, the air thick with smoke and salt, the sound of waves and fevered coughing mingling in the dark. He lifted his eyes to the stars, and he breathed, reminding himself that every voyage begins with uncertainty. Every dream was struggle. One more breath here, and let the image settle. La Isabela under night, lanterns glowing faintly, Men murmuring in weary voices, the ocean whispering just beyond. Columbus sits at his desk, quill in hand, his shadow long against the wall. The forest hums outside. The Taino's distant songs drift like threads in the dark, and the stars glimmer steady above. The town endures, fragile but alive, its story stretching forward slowly, written in hardship and hope, in sickness and beauty, in silence and in dreams. The settlement at La Isabella was a place of both endurance and unrest, and as months passed, the murmurs of discontent swelled into sharper voices. The men had expected riches, yet their hands blistered from labor in soil that yielded poorly. Their bellies ached with hunger, and their bodies weakened with fevers. They had dreamed of golden cities, but they found only small flecks in riverbeds, never enough to satisfy the hopes carried across the sea. At night their whispers grew bolder, their conversations edged with anger, their patience stretched thin. Some accused Columbus of misleading them, of promising more than he could deliver, of chasing dreams while they shouldered hardship. The authority of his titles, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of lands new and vast, did not always silence those who questioned him. To some, he was still an outsider, a foreigner whose words weighed less than their suffering. Columbus heard the discontent, but met it with calm. He spoke softly of patience, of the future that would come if only they endured, of the fortune that lay still hidden in mountains and rivers. He reminded them that Spain itself had been built on centuries of struggle, that no great work came without hardship. Some were reassured by his steady voice, soothed into waiting a little longer, but others muttered still, their eyes hardened, their trust fraying. Small quarrels broke into fights, men raising hands against each other in anger born of hunger and fever. Columbus tried to quiet these quarrels with rules and discipline, but the weight of discontent pressed heavier with each passing day. Stay with me here, because the rebellion was not loud at first but subtle, like the slow gathering of storm clouds. Men wandered away from their work, claiming sickness, claiming weariness, claiming there was no point. Some slipped into the forest, drawn to the Taino villages where food was plentiful, where hammocks swayed in clean air, where life seemed lighter than the burden of La Isabella. Others refused orders outright, their voices rising against Columbus, demanding ships to return home. The admiral, though wounded by their words, kept his composure. He walked among them, reminding them that the monarchs had placed trust in him, that their duty was to Spain, that honor was found in persistence. Yet even he must have felt a tremor of doubt when he returned to his desk at night, writing by candlelight, the sound of restless voices drifting through the humid air. The Taino, watching from a distance, must have sensed the cracks. They had once welcomed the strangers with generosity, but now they saw division among them, hunger that drove them to demand more, tempers that flared too easily. Their songs at night were softer, their faces less open. Columbus, aware of this, tried to hold a balance, offering gifts, arranging meetings, speaking of friendship. But the trust that had once seemed so natural was fragile now, strained by demands and suspicions. The land itself seemed to resist a settlement, and in that resistance, men turned against one another. Breathe slowly here, and picture the nights of that time. The fires in La Isabella burned low, the smoke curling lazily into the damp air. Men sit in clusters, their voices sharp, their hands gesturing in anger, while others sit apart in silence, staring at the dark line of the forest. Columbus writes at his desk, his quill scratching softly, his face illuminated by a lantern glow. He pauses, listening to the murmur of unrest outside, and lifts his gaze to the stars beyond the palm-framed sky. They glitter steady, indifferent to quarrels, to hunger, to doubt. For him they are still guides, as they have been across the sea, reminders that direction can be found even in darkness. As the unrest deepened, Columbus imposed stricter discipline. He ordered men punished for defiance, their bodies reminded through labor and lash that authority must be respected. This bred more resentment, more whispers, more hatred directed toward the man who had once led them across the ocean. Some called him tyrant, others foreigner, others fool. Yet still Columbus stood firm. He did not shout, he did not rage. He moved with calm, his orders spoken evenly, his resolve unshaken. He believed still in the vision that had carried him as a boy, the dream of lands beyond the horizon, of riches waiting, of empire born from patience. That belief steadied him when all else trembled. Stay with me here, because even in rebellion, there were moments of gentleness. Some men, tired of quarrels, walked quietly to the shore at dusk, sitting on rocks as waves lapped steadily, the sea breathing its endless rhythm. They let the sound calm them, let the horizon soften their anger, let the stars remind them the vastness that held their small settlement. In those moments, tempers cooled, hearts eased, voices quieted. Columbus, too, must have walked the short times, his boots sinking into sand, his breath slow in the night air, the surf hushing his thoughts. For a while, the ocean soothed what the land troubled, but rebellion did not vanish. Groups formed, men speaking of leaving, of seizing ships, of return to Spain without him. Some went into the forest, trying to live apart, though few lasted long without the settlement's shelter. Columbus, aware of their schemes, acted with a mixture of firmness and patience. He sent messages, called them back, offered forgiveness, offered calm words in place of anger. Some returned, humbled by hunger or fear, while others remained bitter, their voices still sharp. The settlement endured, fragile, trembling between authority and defiance, between dream and despair. At last Columbus knew he must return to Spain, not only to defend himself, but to remind the monarchs of what he had accomplished. Reports had surely carried whispers of discontent, of failure, of cruelty. He needed to stand before Ferdinand and Isabella again, to speak with a steady voice, to offer proof that the voyage was not in vain. He prepared ships, gathered journals, gold dust, cotton, parrots, and letters. He left La Isabella in the hands of those he trusted, though he knew the garrison was fragile, the men restless, the trust of the Taino frayed. Still, he believed the settlement would hold, that patience would carry it through until he returned. Breathe one more time with me, and picture that departure. The ships at anchor, their sails furled, their timbers scarred by storms but still strong. Men stand on shore, their faces mixed with hope and bitterness, watching as Columbus boards, his cloak brushing the deck, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The ocean waits, vast and steady, the same ocean that had carried him west and now would carry him east again. Behind him, La Isabella glows with faint firelight, the forest humming, the settlement trembling but alive. Ahead lies Spain and the need to defend his dream. For now, the sails rise, the ropes creak, the wind fills and the ships lean eastward, slipping once more into the rhythm of waves. The sea that carried Columbus back to Spain was both familiar and different. Familiar in its endless rhythm of waves, its steady winds, its nights lit by stars he had read since boyhood. Different because this time he sailed not with the thrill of discovery, but with the weight of proving himself, of defending what had already been done. The ships creaked under his feet, their sails taut with wind, their timbers scarred from storms past. The men aboard whispered of home, their voices tinged with relief at the thought of bread and wine, of streets familiar, of loved ones waiting. They carried with them parrots that squawked softly in cages, gold dust sealed in small containers, cotton bales, and letters. These were proof, fragile but real, that the voyage had not been in vain. Columbus, calm but thoughtful, walked the decks each evening, his cloak moving with the breeze, his eyes fixed eastward where Spain waited like a harbor of judgment and hope. The voyage itself passed with the same quiet monotony that the Atlantic so often gave. Days of endless sea, where the horizon circled them with nothing but blue. Nights where stars spread like frost across the sky, their steady light guiding the ships ever closer to home. The men sang softly at times, old songs from villages and ports, their voices carrying low across the water. They spoke of Spain in hushed tones, of taverns and markets, of fields green with wheat, their imagination soothing their hunger for home. Columbus, though sharing the same longing, spent his evenings writing, his hand steady, recording not only what had been seen, but what he believed must come. His words, careful and shaped, were meant to reassure the monarchs that the promise of empire remained vast and sure. Stay with me here, because in the stillness of those nights you can almost hear the hush of sails, the whisper of rope, the soft slap of waves. Imagine Columbus on deck, lantern in hand, his gaze lifted to the sky. He traces the constellations with his mind, the same stars that had led him west now leading him home. The air is cool, carrying salt and promise, and for a moment the weight of La Isabella's troubles falls away. He is once again the sailor who dared where others doubted, the man who crossed where others feared. The ocean suits him, as it always had, steadying the dream he carried still. At last, land appeared on the horizon, green slopes and white walls of Spain. The sight stirred the men into cheers, their voices bright after so many weeks of monotony. They smelled the earth on the wind, the smoke of fires, the sweetness of fields. They leaned on the rails, eyes wide, as the familiar shapes of harbors drew nearer. Columbus stood among them, his heart steady but aware of what awaited. He would be greeted not only with joy but with questions, with suspicion, with expectations heavier than sails. He adjusted his cloak, steadied his breath, and prepared himself as the ships glided into port. The arrival was both triumph and trial. Crowds gathered to see the admiral, the man who had crossed the unknown and returned with riches, with stories of new lands, with living proof in the form of parrots, cotton, and native people brought across the sea. There was awe in their voices, wonder in their eyes, pride in their faces. But there was also curiosity sharpened by doubt. Some whispered that the gold was not as plentiful as promised, that the lands were not cities of marble and silver, but villages of wood and palm. Some envied his titles, his sudden rise in courtly favor, and watched with eyes eager to see him stumble. Columbus walked through it all with calm, his head high, his gaze steady, his voice measured. He spoke of beauty, of rivers and forests, of a world waiting to be shaped, of faith to be spread, of riches yet to be uncovered. Before the monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, he bowed deeply, his words flowing with practiced care. He offered gifts of gold dust, of cotton, of exotic fruits and birds, each one a token of what lay across the sea. He spoke of the Taino, of their openness, their willingness to trade, their souls ready to embrace the faith of Spain. He described rivers that sparkled with promise, mountains that lifted high, lands fertile and vast. His voice was calm, his eyes bright, his conviction as steady as when he had first stood before them years earlier, asking for ships. The monarchs listened, their faces thoughtful but softened by his words, and once again they placed trust in him, breathed slowly, because in these halls of power the air itself was heavy with expectation. Courtiers leaned in to hear his words, their eyes narrow, their lips pursed, measuring him not only by what he brought, but by what he promised. Some smiled politely, others whispered doubts, but Columbus stood firm. He reminded them that discovery is only the first step, that settlement takes time, that gold lies hidden but be found, that empire requires patience as much as courage. His words, wrapped in calm assurance, soothed where suspicion stirred. For a while, his voice was enough to carry the dream forward. Spain celebrated him once more. Bells rang in towns. Songs were sung, his name spoken with pride in taverns and chapels. Yet beneath the praise lay questions, and Columbus knew it. He had defended himself well. But he also knew that whispers traveled faster than truth. He knew that some envied his titles, some doubted his vision, some longed to see him fail. He carried this knowledge quietly, letting it weigh him but not break him. He moved through the celebrations with grace, his mind already turning to the next voyage, the next step in the dream. Stay with me one more moment, and picture him at dusk in Spain, walking alone in a garden outside the court. The air is cool, the scent of blossom sweet, the sound of fountain soft. He pauses beneath an archway, gazing at the horizon where the sun sinks, the same sun that once lit the ocean as he sailed west. He breathes deeply, his cloak stirring the breeze, and in his heart the dream burns still. The troubles of La Isabella, the whispers of dissent, the sickness and hunger, all are heavy, but heavier still is a conviction that what he began must continue. He lifts his eyes to the first stars, steady in the darkening sky, and he feels again the same calm certainty that had carried him across the unknown. The court of Spain, though filled with whispers of doubt, could not resist the pull of possibility. Columbus had returned across the ocean, proof in his hands that new lands lay waiting, vast and rich with promise. Though gold was still scarce, though the treasures were smaller than rumor had imagined, the monarch saw what others did not, the chance to expand Spain's reach beyond any horizon known. And so plans began for another voyage, not of 3 small ships, but of a great fleet, larger and louder, carrying not only sailors but settlers, craftsmen, priests, and officials. Where the first voyage had been a leap of faith, the second would be an enterprise of empire, shaped by crown and council, planned with maps, supplies, and hope that Spain would now lay foundations permanent and enduring. Columbus moved among these preparations with quiet purpose, his voice calm, his manner steady, his eyes alight with the same dream that had carried him across before. Stay with me here, because the scale of this new fleet was unlike the first. 17 ships were gathered in Cadiz, their hulls broad and strong, their sails patched and mended, their decks crowded with men who spoke eagerly of fortune and land. The air at the docks was filled with the smell of pitch and tar, the cries of gulls, the sound of hammers against timber. Families came to watch as supplies were loaded, barrels of wine, sacks of grain, tools, nails, livestock bleating softly in their pens. Among the men were nobles who sought titles, soldiers who sought honor, priests who sought souls, farmers who sought fields, and adventurers who sought gold. Their voices rose in steady hum, a mixture of excitement and impatience, their eyes drawn to horizon where sails would soon rise. Columbus walked among them, his cloak brushing the planks, his gaze calm. He spoke softly to groups, reminding them of patience, of the trials they might face, of the beauty that awaited them. Some listened, nodding, reassured by his tone. Others whispered doubts, though the size of the fleet itself filled them with confidence. At dawn on the day of departure, the harbor was alive with sound. Bells rang, sails flapped, ropes creaked, and voices shouted as anchors were raised. The ships leaned into the wind, their sails swelling white against the morning sky. The fleet moved out together, 17 ships gliding into the open sea, their wakes churning foam, their masts tall as forests carried by the tide. On shore, crowds waved and prayed, their voices fading as the distance grew. The men aboard leaned over rails, staring back at Spain until it was no more than a shadow, then turned their faces eastward toward the unknown. Columbus stood on the flagship's deck, his hand steady on the rail, his eyes fixed forward. The sea stretched vast before them, but he felt no fear. He had crossed it once, and now he crossed it again, not as a dreamer alone, but as admiral of the fleet. Breathe slowly now, and picture the days that followed. The ocean rolled endlessly, but with 17 ships the sight was less lonely. The men looked from deck to deck, seeing sails around them, reassured by numbers, their voices carrying across the water when ships drew near. They sang together at night, their songs rising into the dark, the stars glittering above as though the heavens themselves watched their progress. The parrots squawked, the livestock shifted restlessly, and the smell of grain and salted meat filled the air. Columbus moved quietly among his captains, his orders calm, his confidence steady. He had no fear of storms now, no fear of distance. The ocean was his ally, its winds his companions, its currents his path. There were storms, of course, winds that howled, waves that struck, rain that lashed against sails. But the fleet held together, their hulls creaking, their masts groaning, their men soaked but unbroken. Columbus stood firm through each tempest, his cloak whipping in the wind, his voice steady as he gave orders. The men, seeing him calm, steadied themselves as well. They trusted him still, even if some doubted his promises of riches. He was a sailor, and the ocean seemed to bend to his will. When the storms passed, the fleet pressed onward, the sky clearing, the sea glittering once more beneath the sun. Stay with me a little longer, because the moment of landfall came not with surprise, but with quiet joy. One morning, after weeks of sea, the lookout cried softly at land, and soon all eyes saw it. A green shape rising from the horizon, palm trees swaying, mountains lifting in the haze. The men cheered, their voices carrying across ships, their hearts lifted by the sight. They smelled earth again, sweet and damp, the fragrance of life after endless salt. The parrots in cages squawked more loudly, as though they too sensed home. Columbus stood at the prow, his eyes bright, his heart steady. He had done it again, crossed the ocean, found the lands, and brought with him not only sailors but the beginnings of Spain's empire. The fleet anchored near familiar shores, and once more canoes appeared, paddled by Taino whose faces showed both recognition and caution. They remembered the strangers who had come before, and now they saw not 3 ships but 17, a small armada that filled the horizon. Some approached with curiosity, offering fruit and fish. Others stayed back, their eyes wary. Columbus greeted them warmly, his voice soft, his gestures friendly, offering beads and bells, showing once more his intent of friendship. Yet even he must have known that this arrival was different. The first had been discovery, fleeting and light. The second was settlement, heavy and enduring. The men poured ashore, their boots pressing into sand, their voices loud, their movements filling the land with noise and presence. The balance was shifting, and the island would never be the same. At dusk, fires burned along the beach, ships anchored beyond, their masts dark against the sky. Men sat in circles, their voices low as they shared bread, their eyes on the forest that stretched inland, alive with sounds. Columbus walked among them, speaking gently, his cloak brushing the sand, his face calm in the firelight. He told them of patience, of faith, of the promise that lay in rivers and mountains. They listened, weary but soothed, their eyes softening as night wrapped around them. Beyond the shore, the ocean murmured steadily, its waves breaking in rhythm with their breath. Above, the stars glimmered, steady and timeless, watching once more as the dream of empire pressed forward into the unknown. The second voyage had begun with triumph, a fleet that stretched wide upon the sea, voices full of hope and sails bright with promise. But once the men set their feet again upon the soil of Hispaniola, the weight of reality pressed upon them. 17 ships had carried not only sailors but settlers, priests, craftsmen, and nobles, each with their own expectations, each with their own vision of what they would find. They had dreamed of cities waiting to be claimed, of gold piled in riverbeds, of villages eager to surrender their treasures. What they found instead was a land still wild, forests thick and unyielding, rivers that glimmered but only with small flecks, people generous but cautious, their smiles thinning out as strangers came not in handfuls but in hundreds. The men built new camps along the shore, their tools ringing, their voices carrying, their presence heavy upon the land. Columbus moved among them calmly, his voice steady, reminding them that every foundation must begin in hardship, that what they sought would come with patience, that Spain itself had risen from centuries of trial. The settlement at La Isabela still stood, though it bore the marks of struggle, walls weathered by storms, streets pressed by weary feet, men thin from fever and hunger. Those who had remained greeted the new arrivals with tired eyes, their voices low, their stories filled with hardship. The newcomers listened, their own hopes cooling as they realized the dream was heavier than rumor had told. Some grumbled openly, questioning why they had come. Others turned their eyes to the inland mountains, imagining riches still hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Columbus, sensing both dismay and restless ambition, sought to hold them together with calm authority. He walked the settlement slowly, offering reassurance, speaking of the vastness still to be explored, promising that the riches they longed for were near. His words soothed some, though not all, for doubt lingered like a shadow in every corner. Stay with me here, because the heart of the story lies not only in discovery, but in the strain of governance. Columbus was no longer only a sailor crossing seas. He was a governor, an administrator of a colony where tempers flared, sickness spread, and demands pressed from every side. The settlers grew impatient for gold, the priests pressed for conversion, the nobles sought recognition, and the Taino, once open, now bristled under the weight of demands. The land itself, with its heat, its storms, its unfamiliar soil, seemed to resist their attempts to bend it. Yet Columbus remained steady. He rose early each morning, his cloak stirring in the damp air, his eyes on the mountains that lifted in the distance, convinced still that the promise of empire waited there. The Taino, who had once welcomed freely, began to withdraw. They brought fewer gifts, spoke with more guarded tones, their movements marked by caution. The generosity of first meetings had been strained by the arrival of so many strangers, by demands for food, for labor, for tribute. Columbus sought to maintain peace, offering beads and bells, arranging exchanges, speaking of friendship, but the balance wavered. Some settlers grew harsher, pressing for more, and trust frayed further. At night the songs of the Taino villages carried faintly, softer than before, like threads of sound nearly lost to distance. The settlers, sitting by their fires, heard them and felt the quiet tension, though few spoke of it. The sickness among the Spaniards did not ease. Fever ran through the settlement, leaving men weak, their bodies trembling, their breath shallow in the humid nights. Food spoiled quickly. Grain rotted in barrels, meat soured, and the crops they tried to plant withered in soil they did not yet understand. Hunger returned, gnawing at their spirits, making tempers sharper, quarrels more frequent. Columbus, though suffering at times himself, continued to walk among them, offering steady words, reminding them of patience, of endurance, of faith. His voice carried calm even when his body was weary, and for some it was enough to hold despair at bay. Breathe slowly now, and picture the settlement at dusk. Fires glow faintly, smoke curling into the heavy air. The ocean whispers against the shore, steady and soothing, while the forest hums with insects alive in the dark. Men sit on logs, their faces thin, their eyes tired, their hands busy with nets or tools. Priests chant softly in the church, their voices echoing in the wooden rafters. Columbus sits at his desk, lantern casting shadows across parchment, his quill moving slowly, recording both hardship and hope. He pauses often, gazing at the stars through a small window, their light steady above the palm-framed horizon. For him the stars are not only guides across the ocean, but reminders that beyond difficulty lies direction, beyond darkness lies promise. The settlers grew restless in another way too. They longed for the freedom of exploration, to march inland, to seek the gold they imagined waiting. Columbus permitted expeditions, small groups guided by Taino who knew the paths, and the men returned with stories of rivers sparkling with dust, of mountains vast and green, of villages where ornaments of gold hung lightly from necks and ears. These reports lifted spirits for a time, rekindling the fire of hope. Yet the gold was never in abundance, never in piles that matched the hunger of rumor. Still, Columbus clung to patience, believing that deep within the island the riches must lie. His faith, quiet but unwavering, steadied him when others faltered. Stay with me, because it is here that the quiet strain of leadership weighed most. Columbus bore not only the hardships of the land, but the suspicions of his own men. Some doubted his vision, others resented his authority, still others envied his titles. Whispers carried through the night, murmurs of discontent that he must have heard even from within his own tent. Yet he did not rage, did not falter. He carried himself with the same calm he had shown on the ocean, his voice low, his words measured, his eyes bright with the dream that still burned in him. He knew that leadership was not only steering ships across seas, but guiding weary men through hunger and doubt, holding them steady when storms came not from sky or water, but from within. And so the settlement endured. Fires continued to burn, bells rang, voices rose in prayer, hammers struck wood and stone. The men worked, though with grumbling, their hands shaping what Spain hoped would be its foothold in the new world. The Taino, though distant, still came at times with food, still shared guidance when asked, though their eyes held wariness now. The land, though harsh, still gave fruits sweet to taste, rivers cool to bathe in, forests filled with beauty. Amidst struggle, there were moments of wonder still, birds flashing bright above, flowers glowing in dawn light, stars stretching endless at night. These moments soothed the men, softened their anger, reminded them that the world around them was not only hardship, but beauty vast and steady. One more breath with me, and see the image of that time. Lie Isabella and the new camps along the shore, glowing with lanterns at night, their fires flickering against huts and walls. Men sit in silence, listening to the waves, their hearts heavy but held together by habit. Columbus writes steadily by candlelight, his cloak resting on his shoulders, his face lined with weariness but lit with determination. Beyond the settlement, the months that followed in Hispaniola brought heavier burdens than before, for the fragile balance between the Spaniards and the Taino began to crack beneath the strain of demands and distrust. At first there had been exchanges, food for beads, fish for bells, cotton for knives, and though uneven, the rhythm had held. But with so many new settlers, the appetite of the colony grew vast, and the Taino could not meet it without hardship of their own. When they hesitated, some Spaniards pressed harder, their voices sharp, their hands impatient, and what had begun in friendship faltered into tension. Villages that once welcomed now stood more distant, their smiles thinner, their offerings fewer. Columbus, aware of the shifting air, tried to mend it with words of peace, with gifts, with promises, but not all his men shared his patience. Some took by force what had once been given freely, and in those moments the trust that had lit the first meetings dimmed further. The settlers themselves were restless. Many had come not to build but to gather treasure, and when days passed with little gold to show, their voices grew loud in complaint. They accused Columbus of misleading them, of hiding riches, of keeping secrets. They quarreled with one another, with their leaders, with the Taino who had once been their allies. Columbus walked among them steadily, his voice calm, his gaze firm, reminding them that discovery is not harvest, that riches lie hidden, that patience is the path. Yet even his steady presence could not silence every doubt. Whispers carried at night, men speaking of return to Spain, of seizing ships, of abandoning the dream. The admiral heard the whispers but bore them quietly, trusting that his vision, clear as the stars he followed, would endure. Stay with me here, because the strain of these days lay not only in words but in hunger. Supplies rotted in the heat, crops failed, sickness spread, and the men felt the island itself resisted their presence. Fever left them weak, sores marked their skin, their bodies heavy with exhaustion. In such times tempers flare easily, and quarrels turn to violence. Columbus, though weary himself, continued to walk the settlement with calm authority, urging prayer, urging endurance, urging faith. He carried himself with the same composure he had shown at sea, his belief in the dream unshaken, though his nights must have been heavy with solitude. The Taino, watching, felt the shift as well. They had once marveled at the ships, at the beads and bells, at the cloth and steel, but now they saw the settlers' hunger, their impatience, their quarrels. They began to resist, quietly at first, withholding food, retreating deeper into forests, keeping distance. Some villages closed themselves off, their chiefs wary, their people cautious. Columbus sought to preserve friendship, sending envoys with gifts, speaking words of alliance, but trust once strained is slow to mend. The songs that once carried warmly at night now drifted faint and distant, fragile threads of sound nearly lost in the vast darkness. Breathe slowly here, and picture the nights of that time. Fires flicker low in the settlement, men gathered in weary silence, their faces thin, their eyes shadowed by fever and doubt. The ocean whispers steadily against the shore, its rhythm unchanged, its voice soothing even as men quarrel. Columbus sits by lantern light, his quill moving slowly across parchment, writing letters meant for Spain, shaping hardships into words of promise. He writes of rivers rich with potential, of mountains vast and untapped, of people gentle and open to faith. His words, calm and measured, carry not only what is seen but what is hoped, as though ink itself could bridge the distance between dream and reality. The discontent among the Spaniards hardened further, and soon voices rose not only in complaint but in defiance. Nobles among the settlers, men of rank and pride, bristled under the authority of a Genoese mariner elevated above them. They whispered that they could lead better, that they could govern more justly, that Columbus was unfit. The admiral, aware of their envy, responded not with anger but with discipline. He enforced order, punished rebellion, and reminded them the crown's trust placed upon him. His calm demeanor did not disguise the firmness of his hand. Yet each punishment bred more bitterness, each act of authority more whispers of tyranny. The settlement became a place of uneasy silence, where smiles were forced and words carried weight. Stay with me, because amidst the hardship there were still moments of wonder. Expeditions inland revealed waterfalls that roar like thunder, valleys green and fertile, forests alive with birds that shone like jewels in flight. The men, weary from toil, paused in awe at these sights. Their hearts lightened for a time, their complaints softened. They tasted fruit sweet and refreshing, bathed in rivers cool and clear, rested in the shade of trees that seemed as ancient as the sky. Even Columbus, burdened though he was, must have felt the soothing power of these moments, when the beauty of the world reminded him why he had dreamed in the first place. For a little while, the anger quieted, the hunger eased, the doubt softened, but the balance could not last. Demands pressed harder, patience frayed thinner, trust dwindled further. The Spaniards built forts deeper inland, their presence heavier upon the land, their demands upon the Taino sharper. Resistance began to rise, quiet but steady, like roots pushing through stone. Columbus knew it, sensed it, felt it in the wary eyes of the people, in the silence where once there had been song. He walked through the settlement at dusk, his cloak brushing against dust, his gaze lifting to mountains where he believed gold still waited. He prayed quietly, his words soft in the humid air, asking for strength, for patience, for guidance. The ocean breathed behind him, the forest whispered before him, and he stood between them, a man carrying a dream heavy with struggle. One more breath with me, and let the image rest gently in your mind. The settlement glowing faintly with lantern light, fires flickering, men murmuring in low voices, the Taino villages distant and silent, the forest vast and watchful. Columbus sits at his desk, writing by candle, his face lined with weariness but steady still, his eyes reflecting both flame and star. The dream endures, though trembles, its weight pressing heavier with each passing day. Above, the stars shine steady, as they always had, guiding him still, even as the land beneath his feet resisted his steps. The peace that had once held fragile at La Isabella now began to tear, for neither the settlers nor the Taino could bear the weight of the demands placed upon them. The Spaniards, restless and weary, still longed for gold in quantities that never seemed to appear. Their hunger grew sharper, their tempers more brittle, their quarrels more frequent. Many accused Columbus openly now, their voices raised against him, their words bitter, their patience gone. They had crossed the ocean for fortune, yet they found themselves caught in toil, sickness, and uncertainty. Some nobles among them, proud men who believed their rank outweighed his titles, stirred unrest, whispering of rebellion, plotting against his authority. Columbus, though wounded by their mistrust, met them with calm. His voice remained steady, his manner firm, his belief in his vision unbroken. But the dream he carried was no longer shared by all. It trembled in their hands, heavy with doubt. The Taino, too, pulled away. What had begun as friendship and generosity was strained now by tribute demanded, by food taken without exchange, by labor pressed too heavily. They looked upon the newcomers with suspicion, their once open smiles replaced by guarded stares. Some villages retreated deeper into forests, their fires no longer visible at night, their songs no longer carried on the wind. Others resisted quietly, refusing to provide food, withholding guidance, turning their backs on the settlers. A tension hung over the land, silent but heavy, like the air before a storm. Columbus sensed it, tried to mend it with gestures of peace, but the trust that had been broken could not easily be restored. His dream of harmony faltered, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. Stay with me here, because in these days the settlement seemed caught between two storms. On one side the Spaniards, hungry and impatient, clamoring for gold, doubting their leader, resenting the hardships that filled their days. On the other, the Taino, no longer companions but cautious neighbors, their patience waning, their trust fading. And between them stood Columbus, a man of vision, a sailor turned governor, his hands stretched to hold both sides steady, his eyes still fixed on the dream of empire. He bore the weight with calm, but even calm cannot silence the unease that grows louder with each passing day. The settlers' defiance sharpened. Some refused orders, others plotted openly. A few spoke of seizing ships to return home. Columbus responded with firmness, imposing punishments, reminding them of the crown's authority, demanding obedience. His actions, though necessary to preserve order, deepened resentment. Men called him tyrant in hushed voices, foreigner in bitter tones, fool in angry whispers. The settlement became a place of watchful silence, where loyalty was uncertain, where every glance carried suspicion. Columbus felt it but endured, walking among them with the same measured steps, his cloak brushing the dust, his voice low but steady. He had weathered storms at sea, and now he weathered storms of men. The Taino's resistance also grew. Where once they had guided Spaniards through forests and rivers, now they turned away, leaving paths unmarked, food ungathered, fires unshared. Some chiefs refused tribute, their voices quiet but firm, their eyes holding both sadness and defiance. Columbus, desperate to maintain ties, sent envoys with beads and trinkets, with gestures of friendship, but these gifts no longer carried the same magic. Trust had been worn thin, and suspicion had taken its place. A few incidents turned to skirmishes, small clashes along rivers or in villages where demands pressed too hard. Voices rose, hands struck, and blood was shed, faint but real, marking the change from uneasy peace to open tension. Breathe slowly here, and imagine the nights of that time. Fires burned low in the settlement. Men huddled together, their voices sharp with anger or hushed with fear. The forest beyond is dark and watchful, alive with sound that seemed heavier than before. Columbus sits by lantern light, his quill scratching slowly across parchment, his words carefully shaped for Spain. He writes of progress, of riches glimpsed, of souls ready for faith. Yet between the lines lies a shadow of unease, the truth that harmony is breaking, that patience is fraying. He pauses often, gazing at the stars of the palm-framed window, seeking comfort in their steady light. The stars have always guided him, and even now they soothe him, whispering a direction beyond the storm at hand. Expeditions inland still carried men deeper into the island, but even these journeys grew tense. Some Taino guided them reluctantly, their movements stiff, their voices short. Others refused entirely, leaving the Spaniards to stumble through forests alone. They returned with small flecks of gold, enough to spark brief hope, but not enough to silence despair. Stories of waterfalls and valleys still filled their voices, moments of wonder softening their anger, but the hunger for treasure was not eased. Columbus listened, wrote, believed, but the gap between vision and reality widened. Stay with me a little longer, because Columbus himself was not free from weariness. His health wavered, his body weakened by fever, his strength tested by the strain of leadership. Yet he rose each morning, walked among the men, spoke with calm conviction, and carried himself as steady as the ocean had once carried his ships. He bore his own doubts silently, never showing them, never letting his men see the shadows in his heart. He was still admiral, still viceroy, still the man chosen by monarchs, and he would not falter in the face of hardship. His dream was heavier now, but he held it still, and so Hispaniola trembled, caught between settlers restless and natives resisting, between hunger and hope, between vision and doubt. Fires glowed at night, bells rang faintly by day, but a harmony that had once seemed possible was now replaced by strain. Columbus stood at the center, his cloak stirring in the humid air, his gaze fixed on mountains inland, still convinced that riches waited there. He prayed quietly at night, his voice soft, his words blending with the sigh of the ocean. The forest hummed around him. The stars glimmered above, and the dream endured, fragile but alive, carried forward not by ease but by his unyielding faith. One last breath here, and let the image settle. La Isabel and the new camps glowing faintly in the night, men murmuring with discontent. The Taino distant and silent, the forest vast and watchful. Columbus sits alone at his desk, candle flickering, his face weary but determined, his eyes reflecting both flame and star. The dream trembles, but it does not break. Above, the constellations shimmer, steady and timeless, guiding him still through the storm of men, as they once guided him across the ocean wide. By the time another year had passed in Hispaniola, the tensions that had begun as murmurs now rose openly, and Columbus found his authority not only questioned but defied. The settlement was weary, its people thin from hunger, its huts marked by storms, its streets worn by restless feet. Men who had once whispered now spoke aloud, their anger sharpened by fever, by empty stomachs, by the absence of treasure. Nobles with titles from Spain, men accustomed to power, bristled under the command of a foreign-born admiral. They gathered in small groups, their voices sharp, their words heavy with resentment. Some plotted to seize control, to rule in his place, to send him back across the sea in disgrace. Columbus, though aware of their schemes, bore himself calmly, his manner steady, his words even, as though quiet could soothe where anger grew loud. The Spaniards were not united, for among them were those still loyal to him, men who remembered the courage with which he had crossed the ocean, the certainty with which he had guided them to new shores. These men spoke in his defense, urging patience, reminding others that hardship was the birthright of every new land. Yet the voices of loyalty were fewer now, drowned by the louder cries of frustration. Columbus moved carefully, punishing open rebellion, pardoning others, balancing firmness with mercy. His calm demeanor did not disguise the strain he carried, but he showed no fear, no faltering. His dream still burned, though it flickered in the wind of discontent. Stay with me here, because the colony itself mirrored this unrest. The huts leaned in the wind. The crops struggled in soil unfamiliar. The bell of the church rang weakly over men too weary to gather. Fires smoked in the damp air, their glow faint, their warmth too little against the heaviness of spirit. The Taino no longer came freely to trade. When they appeared, it was with wary eyes, their steps cautious, their words few. The songs that had once carried warmly across the night air were gone, replaced by silence, by distance, by suspicion. The Spaniards felt the absence keenly, though few admitted it aloud. They sat by their fires at night, listening to the hum of insects, to the sigh of the ocean, to the emptiness where music had once been. Columbus, seeing the unrest deepen, wrote letters for Spain, shaping hardship into words of promise. He described not only the difficulties but also the wonders, the rivers glimmering with gold dust, the forests filled with birds bright as jewels, the people gentle and open to faith. His ink carried not only truth but hope, for he knew the monarchs must be reassured. The dream must remain alive in their eyes if he were to continue. He wrote with steady hand, even as his heart must have carried doubt, even as he heard the voices of rebellion outside his door. The rebellion grew bolder. Men openly defied his orders, claiming that his vision was folly, that he was unfit to govern. Some tried to seize supplies. Others plotted to escape into forests. Still others sought to seize ships and return to Spain. Columbus responded with firmness, arresting some, restraining others, punishing enough to remind them of the crown's authority. Yet each punishment bred new bitterness. Each act of control hardened defiance. The colony became a place of uneasy silence, where glances carried meaning, where loyalty was uncertain, where fear and resentment mingled in every voice. Columbus bore it with calm, but the weight pressed heavily on him. Breathe slowly here, and picture the nights of that time. The ocean still whispered steadily against the shore, its rhythm unchanged, soothing even as men quarreled. The forest still hummed with insects, alive with unseen creatures, steady in its breath. The stars still glimmered, steady in their constellations, guiding as they always had. Yet beneath this steady world, the colony trembled. Fires burned low. Men spoke in harsh voices. The Taino kept their distance. Columbus sat at his desk, lantern light flickering on parchment, his face lined, his eyes shadowed, his hand still steady. He wrote with patience, shaping words that might carry hope across the sea, words that might preserve his dream even as it faltered in the present. And still, amidst the unrest, moments of beauty remained. Expeditions inland revealed valleys vast and green, waterfalls that sang through forests, rivers cool and sparkling. The men, weary though they were, paused in awe at these sights. Their hearts lightened for a moment. Their complaints softened. They ate fruits fresh and sweet, bathed in streams, rested in hammocks strung between trees. These small mercies soothed them, reminded them that the land was not only hardship, but also wonder. Columbus, too, must have felt these moments as balm, reminders of the vision that had driven him from boyhood. The belief that beyond hardship lay discovery, beyond struggle lay greatness. Stay close, because it is here that the strain of leadership pressed hardest. Columbus bore not only the hunger and sickness of his men, but also their envy, their suspicion, their rebellion. He bore the silence of the Taino, their withdrawal, their resistance. He bore the expectations of Spain, the need to send word of riches and faith. His body weakened by fever, his spirit heavy with burden, he still carried himself with calm, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on the dream. He had crossed the ocean when others said it could not be done. He had touched lands unknown. He had planted the first fragile roots of settlement. Now he held the weight of empire in hands tired but unyielding. One more breath with me, and let the image settle. The settlement glowing faintly in the night, huts leaning, fires flickering, men murmuring in low voices, their hearts divided. The forest looms dark beyond, the ocean whispers steady, the stars glimmer above, indifferent yet guiding. And in the center sits Columbus, candle flickering, quill in hand, his face weary but determined, his eyes reflecting both flame and star. His dream trembles but does not break. The night holds silence heavy with strain, yet also the steady breath of the world, carrying them all forward into what must come. The story of Columbus's early years in the New World came not to a triumphant close, but to a weary settling, as though the tide itself had carried him far and now ebbed back in slow retreat. The settlement at La Isabela, meant to shine as Spain's first great foothold, had grown tired and strained, its huts leaning, its men thinner, its voices sharp with complaint. Gold was scarce, harmony was broken. The Taino who had once welcomed now stood at a distance, their trust frayed. The settlers muttered openly, their discontent sharper, their loyalty fragile. Columbus himself, once a mariner guided by stars, was now a governor weighed down by quarrels, rebellion, sickness, and doubt. Yet through it all, he remained steady, his voice calm, his dream intact, though his eyes carried shadows of exhaustion. He was no longer the dreamer standing alone before monarchs, but a man caught in a heavy web of empire. Word traveled slowly across the ocean, carried in letters written by Columbus with careful hand. Letters that told not of failure but of promise, of rivers with gold dust, of people ready for faith, of land vast and fertile. In Spain, those words stirred interest, but they also stirred suspicion, for reports from others carried less hope and more hardship. The monarchs listened, weighing faith against doubt, glory against cost. Columbus's name was no longer only tied to triumph, but also to quarrel, and whispers began to rise even in the courts that had once honored him. He did not know how his reputation shifted an ocean away. He only knew that he must endure, must hold steady until new supplies came, until relief arrived, until the dream could breathe again. Stay with me here, because the ending is not sudden but slow, like the dimming of a lantern. The colony did not collapse, nor did it flourish. It lingered fragile, surviving day by day. The men who had once sung with hope now muttered with discontent. The Taino who had once danced by firelight now kept the shadows. Columbus himself, worn by fever, wrote at his desk, his hand steady even as his body trembled. He prayed often, his voice low in the humid night, asking for strength, for guidance, for patience. He had once crossed the ocean on faith alone. Now he asked that same faith to carry him through this long storm of men. The ships that had brought settlers began to sail back, some carrying men who refused to stay, others bearing reports that would shape how Spain saw him. Columbus watched them leave, the sails shrinking against the horizon, and must have felt both relief and fear. Relief that the most restless were gone, fear what their words would become in distant courts. He stood at the shore, his cloak stirring the wind, his gaze fixed on the vanishing sails, his mind already reaching across the ocean to where his fate would soon be judged. The ocean that had once been his ally now seemed like a wall, wide and unyielding, between his dream and its survival. Yet even in those weary days, beauty lingered. At dawn the skies still blushed with color over the palm-framed horizon. At night the stars still stretched endless, steady and timeless. Birds still flashed bright in the forest. Rivers still sang softly as they moved to the sea. Flowers still bloomed vivid against green leaves. The land itself remained rich with life, even if the men who came sought only gold. Columbus, walking alone at dusk, must have seen it, must have felt the quiet wonder even as burden weighed him down. Perhaps in those moments he remembered the boy he once had been, staring out to sea, dreaming of horizons. The dream was heavier now, but it was still the same dream, alive and beating within him. Breathe with me now, as we settle into the quiet close of his first great cycle. The story does not end here, for Columbus will return again and again, his voyages shaping not only his life, but the fate of continents. Yet this chapter is journey. The second voyage turned to struggle, the dream dimmed by hardship, shows the truth behind discovery. It is never easy, never simple, never without cost. Columbus endured, holding steady, his eyes always lifted to the stars, his faith unbroken even when surrounded by doubt. And as we let the story rest, we too may rest, knowing that history flows like the tide, steady, unhurried, always carrying forward. One more moment, one more image to hold gently. The settlement at night, huts glowing faintly with lantern light, fires low, men murmuring, the forest vast and dark, the ocean sighing steadily beyond. Columbus sits alone at his desk, candle flickering, his quill moving slowly, his face weary but his eyes bright still with the spark of vision. He pauses, looks out at the night, sees the stars steady above, and breathes. The dream is not finished, though it falters. The journey is not ended, though it bends. He writes one more line, folds a parchment, seals it, and sets it aside, a letter meant for distant hands. And as he leans back, the candle flame wavers, the night deepens, and the story softens into silence. And so, softly we too come to rest. The tale has been told. The dream has been carried across the ocean and through the storms, and though the man was weary, the story endures. Sleep now with the sound of waves in your mind, with the image of stars steady above, with the warmth of firelight fading slowly. Tomorrow there will be more stories, more journeys, more dreams. But for now, you are safe, the night is gentle, and the history has been told slowly, kindly, as though by a friend beside you.